Chapter 1. Think about it, in a world where your all is measured by something so accurate and tangible as a number, and that number directly feeds into how powerful you are, well, of course those with more are going to lord it over those with less. Fantasizing that society wouldn't be anything but a hierarchical nightmare is simply naive. The man who lived in a pythos. What level are you? I'm level 1. Exactly. Like a child. She flicked him on the nose. She had to bend down to do so due to his height, a diminutive 4'6", a child's height. Which would have been fine if he were a child, but as an adult human it wasn't exactly ideal. Rain reacted a moment too slowly to fend off the flick and his skinny arm whistled through the air hitting nothing. She laughed at his flailing and wrapped her arm around Adlin's shoulders. Oh, the child rage. Pathetic. I'm not a child. Just help me like you said you would and I'll grow out of this. That's how this leveling thing works. It builds up your body. Stamp your foot harder if you want it so much. No, better yet, lick my foot, leered the elf girl. Ew. Are you serious, Myra? Said Adlin, eyeing the elf hanging off his side. Deadly serious. She flicked off one of her sandals and waggled her toes. Rain eyed her foot with dismay. Come on, you worthless little shit, tongue between my toes, or I'm going to leave you in the forest to die. No one will say anything, and you know you don't have the levels needed to survive out here. Your life depends on me, on us. Do you want to die? Rain wanted to run away, never to see the horrible elf girl again, but he knew he would be throwing away the tiny thread of hope that had drawn him out of town, and likely his life too. Rain was a survivor, his life had centered around it, and survivors did what was needed to survive. So, unhappily, reluctantly, he got to his knees and crawled toward her. Holy shit, he's actually going to do it. What a little freak. Laughed Adlin. Rain crept forward and stretched out his tongue, the tip about to touch the tip of her toe. Myra shrieked and kicked him in the face hard. He collapsed to the ground. Gross. He touched me, said Myra, dramatically wiping her toe on the grass as though to rid herself of the touch. Adlin rolled his eyes. You were going to do that from the start, Myra. You'd never let a dirty little runt like him touch you. True, a level 1 is no better than trash, really. A level like yours, on the other hand. She looked up at him with half-lidded eyes, then grabbed his hand and placed it on her hip. Rain looked up at them from the ground. He hated this, he hated his situation that had led him to be so reliant on these arrogant assholes. Most of all, he hated himself for being jealous of them. Adlin was a muscular giant at 6'3" and Myra had the look of a toned athlete, tall for a female elf at 5'11". The gift of leveling young. Leveling young meant a stronger, bigger body as it boosted growth and development. He himself had none of that. Much of his childhood had been marred by nights going cold and hungry, desperate enough to chew pieces of leather to numb the hunger pangs. He remained stuck at level 1 because there had been no one willing to help him find and kill a monster. Suffice to say, the lack of levels and the lack of food had ruined his growth. He looked positively skeletal in comparison to the pair. He slowly got to his knees. Keep perving because you're never going to get this, said Myra, grinding up against Adlin. Tease. Should we do it in front of him? It would be pretty twisted, said Myra. I would, but no, the others will be back any moment now. Fine. No. Show. Rain gritted his teeth and held back a scathing comment. He had an overwhelming urge to lay into them, but he was dependent on their goodwill and couldn't afford to go against them in the slightest. He wiped blood from his lip and slowly climbed to his feet. Myra, stop fucking around. The horses are hobbled. Let's get inside this damn dungeon already, said an even taller guy than Adlin, who pushed aside the foliage and stepped into the clearing. A pair of girls followed behind. Rain eyed him warily. While Adlin was an intimidating level 19, this one, Rax, was an incredible level 28, a prodigy, and because of that one of the most desirable men in the dungeon town of Lynthia, Rain's home. Seriously, Rain had seen him simply walk up to a random woman and take her hand and draw her away. She would happily follow, hopping like an eager rabbit into the nearest bedroom with him. It helped that he looked like an idealized Adonis with long black slightly curled hair, though as always a person's level was cause for greatest attraction. A high number charmed people like nothing else. That 2 of the 3 girls of the team seemed to have attached themselves to him did not surprise Rain in the slightest. In fact, he was more surprised Adlin had any chance at all with Myra. Oh, we were just having a little fun, nothing serious. She pouted at him. Just a little, eh? He slapped his thigh and Myra bounced over to him where he wrapped one large arm around her hips. Adlin scowled seeing that. Rain had to hold in a snort of laughter. He knew well that Adlin would love to say something, but like himself he would have to keep his thoughts unspoken for fear of getting beaten to a pulp by the higher leveler. Hey, you wanted us to go? Well, let's go, said Adlin, clearly hoping to distract Brax from Myra. He gestured behind himself to a stone entrance. It was an impressive thing, the entrance to a dungeon. At least 20 feet tall and built from heavy block stonework. Large angular runes from a dead language marked the thick arch, the stone chipped and marred with age beneath thick green moss that crawled across its surface. Brax caught Rain's eye. Scared, little Rain. This isn't where runts should tread. If you must know, yeah, I am. Weren't you scared to fight your first monster? Brax snorted. Nah, power leveling is easy, you just gotta hold a knife steady once the monster is pinned. I stabbed the shit out of mine, was fun as hell. You would say that, you overleveled. Grumbled Adlin, stopping himself from finishing. Ooh, I bet you could take him solo these days though. Cooed Myra, running a hand across Brax's chest. Brax smirked at Adlin's irritation. Around here most monsters are easy for me. I would need to find something a bit rarer to provide a challenge. Come on Brax, I'm not here to hear you brag about your levels as well as your prowess in bed, said one of the girls who had followed him into the clearing. Ah, I'm pretty sure I satisfied your curiosity on the latter one. But sure, let's get inside and get you your promised levels. The runt too. Myra clung to him as he strode into the darkness of the dungeon and Adlin followed, scowling unhappily. He was followed by the two girls, then lastly came Rain, bringing up the rear. Rain had to walk quickly to keep up. That he had been allowed to join a team going to power level lower levelers was something that Rain was still having trouble adjusting to. He was the town's runt, or near enough, a stunted level 1. How had he come to be like that? Unfortunately for Rain, his father had attacked the town's ranker when Rain was a child for trying to take Rain's mother. Attacking the highest leveled person in town and its de facto leader when you hadn't even broken level 20, well, it wasn't exactly a wise decision. Still, Rain's father had fought like a demon and by some incredible fluke he had permanently blinded the ranker in one eye. Which was the worst result imaginable. The ranker had brutally crippled Rain's father in furious retaliation and then tortured his mother to death in front of him. Then, surprisingly, he sentenced him with a black mark and let him live. This meant little to the man who'd seen his wife suffer and die in front of his eyes, and from then on he had escaped into the bottle. This left Rain with a broken home and a drunkard for a father. Worse, a black mark meant that any descendants of the man were to be made to suffer the same punishment. Sins of the father, in practice that meant one person, Rain. He didn't understand at the time. Being made a pariah and being banned from being power leveled seemed like nothing, not even a real punishment. It wasn't until he started to grow older that he realized he had been handed a slow death sentence. No way to increase his level because he was too weak to kill even the weakest of monsters and no one to help him. His father had passed a few years ago, a decade of booze and self-harm, and Rain had woken one day to find he had not returned home. He found him several hours later, having passed out in an alley and caught his death of cold, leaving Rain alone in the world. Things only got worse after that and Rain was reduced to begging. Most ignored his pleas for fear of angering the town's ranker, but he had survived, just. And now he was here, having somehow wormed his way into a group going out to a dungeon to power level. It was as he had hoped. The death of his father and so many years having passed had softened people's hearts and caused them to forget the ranker's black mark. Of course his weak and pathetic state was not so easy to ignore, but he would just have to make up for that by working really hard once he started leveling. Ahead the two girls chattered. One a human, one a halfling. He listened warily. Did you hear? Said the human, Alfreda got her 23rd level a few days ago. If she keeps going at this rate she's going to overtake Brax. TCH, that woman has enough boys hanging off her arms. She'll be even more smug and insufferable if she becomes one of the top levelers in town. Oh, like you can talk about hanging off of arms. You're like a leech on Brax's side, suck suck suck, and in more than one way. Hey, shut up, it's paying off, isn't it? Who else can say they're getting personally power leveled by tall, handsome, and absurdly high leveled over there? Plenty of girls, I'll tell you. You wouldn't be the first. I suppose you would know being Queen Leech. Oh, I'm in it for more than just the leveling. MRMHM. Next guy who comes along with a few more levels and chiseled abs and you'll jump off Brax like a rat off a sinking ship. Guilty. Rain had heard the way levelers spoke for his entire life, but it still managed to set him on edge. He wondered if it was because he was in a lot of ways an outsider looking in. They caught up as the others paused. "Eliza, Lyra, keep it down would you," grumbled Adlin, "you're going to attract goblins or worse." Eliza, the human, stuck her tongue out at him. "We're going down. There's nothing up here on the first floor that will gain us levels, well apart from for the runt, but chasing down weak monsters for his sake isn't something I'm wasting my time with." "That's okay, just let me stab whatever you normally fight and forget I'm here otherwise," murmured Rain. "Shut it, runt," spat Myra. Brax snorted, then gestured at a wide stairway. The group followed as he descended. The stairs went deeper and deeper, each stair coming down onto a new floor which Brax promptly ignored and moved to go further down. Rain would be lying if he said he wasn't nervous. All the power leveling from scratch he had heard about normally involved the first floor where the monsters were weaker. If he was to be hit by a monster this far down, he would be nothing but a bloody smear on the ground. He almost verbalized a question, to ask if this wasn't a bit much, but instead he carefully bit it back and kept it to himself. The last thing he wanted was to be seen second-guessing Brax. At last, the stairs ended and they came out into a cavern dimly lit from above by massive grand crystal formations. A lake filled most of the cavern floor. "Wow," said Lyra. "Some of the best monsters this dungeon has to offer like to hang around here. It's prime real estate for leveling if you're smart about it, and more to the point, it's great for power leveling." Rain simply stared in wonder as the lake reflected the light of the ethereal glowing crystal. The lake had to be at least a kilometer or so across, likely more. What a wondrous place to finally begin his journey and join the leveled. He startled seeing the group trundle away from him and raced to catch up, hope rising in his heart. "You see, monsters have to drink at some point. Guess where they come? This lake, obviously. The short of it is that instead of wandering around aimlessly, we can simply wait for the monsters to turn up here one by one." Yeah, very clever, this is a good spot, we got it," said Adlin. "Well, they don't know that. I'm saying it for their sake, so shut your trap." "Ah, here we go." Brax came to a stop by the shore. A large boulder blocked his path. "Looks like a boulder, doesn't it? Watch." He drew his sword, a brutal-looking thing that had clearly seen a lot of use, and he swiftly drove it into the side of the boulder. The boulder let out a keening scream and its legs that had been tucked beneath its form sprung outward, revealing it to be a gigantic toad monster with rough pebbled skin. Brax yanked his sword free as the toad leapt away angrily, hissing and screaming like a kettle. Adlin charged it from the side and jabbed at it with the spear he had unslung from his back, scoring hit after hit. The toad raged and awkwardly turned to face him. "Myra, care!" shouted Adlin. He sidestepped as the monster opened its mouth and a long oily black tongue lunged outward, aiming straight at him. Myra took the opportunity and flung out her palm. A violet fireball flared and shot toward the toad like a screaming comet. It landed in its mouth where it promptly exploded. The toad's tongue snapped back as it cried out in pain, trying to spit out and extinguish the fire. Adlin took the monster's distraction as an opportunity and scored a hit on its eye. Eye goop spurted as he successfully blinded it. The toad had lost all reason by this point and was charging around aimlessly. Brax stepped in and with a vicious arcing cut he chopped off one of its legs. The toad slumped to the ground where Brax wasted no time in delimbing it. "Lyra, you're up." Lyra stepped forward nervously with a knife in her hand. She swallowed and then with a yell drove the knife down. The monster shuddered as she withdrew it. "My turn," said Eliza as she drew her sword and added a practiced cut. "Easy." Now it was Rain's turn. His knife was a rusty table knife he had stolen and secreted away. He had obsessively sharpened it before he had left town, but it remained a poor weapon. Still, he only needed a pointed bit of metal, enough to draw blood. He gripped the handle with sweaty palms and raised it above his head, ready to plunge it into the monster's side. His arm swung down. Myra caught his arm mid-swing, her arm as unbending as iron. She tittered. "Oh, you actually thought we would let you level, how cute." She twisted his arm until it felt like his bones would break and he was forced to drop the knife with a gasp. He watched with mounting horror as Brax leant down and swiftly punched his sword into the toad's head, killing it instantly. "Oh, I leveled up. I'm level 15. Exclaimed Lyra, jumping on the spot with glee. Rain could only stare at the dead and unmoving toad. "Why?" he breathed. "Because the town ranker doesn't forgive or forget. but he does get sick of seeing you begging in the streets for scraps. You make us look bad when out-of-towners visit. Brax shrugged. He gave you to us. Rain suddenly ran at Brax with hands raised, recklessly trying to throttle him. Brax simply laughed and lightly brushed him aside. To Rain it felt like being hit by a sledgehammer, and he was knocked tumbling across the ground. Breath came painfully and he realized he had likely broken a rib, likely more than one. Oops, I forgot how weak you were. Hey, don't break my toy before I get a turn. Scowled Myra. Rain felt a hand grab his wrist and drag him up. Oh, so weak, so pathetic. You're like a doll, said Myra. She grabbed at his old and tattered clothing and ripped his shirt off, followed by his trousers and undergarments. Aw, I thought you would just have a nub down there like a doll. Guess not, but it's as stunted as you are, just look at that little thing. She pulled a knife free from her belt and poked it at his genitals. Rain's eyes went round and he screamed as he felt the tip of the blade go in slightly. Please. I didn't do anything to you, why are you doing this? Lyra, Eliza. Stop them please. Brax scoffed. They aren't going to help you. Sorry Rain, it's better this way, shrugged Lyra. You never could accept it Rain. If you are stunted for so long you can't ever escape that, you never had a hope. What? Myra dropped him and he fell bonelessly to the cold damp stone. Myra drove a boot into his stomach and he went rolling across the ground. He clawed at his stomach in pain. Tell me. What do you mean? Eliza looked between Myra and Brax. Rain, it wouldn't have mattered, it's not well known, but past a certain point an unleveled and stunted human is simply unable to gain levels. That's why humans power level their young so early compared to other races. It's a racial trait. No. Why you're lying. Udlin casually poked at him with the tip of his spear, drawing blood. She's not lying, the only worth you have left is our amusement. Haha yes. Dance my little doll dance. Myra flicked fire at Rain's feet, causing him to scuttle back in fear. A fireball landed awkwardly and violet fire splattered up his leg. Rain screamed as it ate into his flesh. He desperately smacked it out, burning his hands in the process. Oh, he has a voice on him, doesn't he? Care, he might attract monsters. That's fine, we can use them to power level once we're done with this. Rain crawled toward Lyra, the halfling, the only one he hoped would have some sliver of sympathy left. Please Lyra. I'm a leveler. I'm a person. You can't let them do this to me. He clutched at her boots. I just wanted to level up like you. Lyra's face went from what Rain interpreted as potential sympathy to a sneer of disgust. Don't touch me with your filthy hands. I've seen you scrabbling around in bins. Eliza's right, you're just stunted trash and a burden on the town. She kicked his hands away. Rain paused. He realized it was over. He was surrounded by monsters as bad as the monsters that inhabited this dungeon. No, worse, these monsters killed not for food but out of contempt. Anger built in his chest and all the frustrations of a lifetime. Kept down for something he didn't do welled up in him. You damn you. He stumbled to his feet, one hand still clutching at his stomach. You're all psychotic, amoral scum. I don't deserve any of this. I'll fucking haunt you, I'll curse you. I'll minus. Brax's sword whipped through the air and lopped off his arm. Rain stared down at the stump poking from his shoulder and at his arm limp on the ground. He could feel himself going into shock. Hey. Don't finish him off too quick, said Myra, bouncing up behind him. Her knife went into his side with a sickening squelch. Words fled Rain as his thoughts started to shut down. Don't finish him off quick, she says as she stabs him in the kidney. Fuck's sake Myra, growled Adlin. He flicked his spear and casually dismembered Rain's other arm at the elbow. Do we get levels for killing him? I should get in on this, said Eliza as she lazily gutted him. His intestines spilled out of the slit in his stomach. Oh God's the mess. Eliza, you don't cut there. Stomach smell. And no, you don't get levels, that's monsters only. Oh. My mistake. Well, he's not much better than a goblin, so who knows. Rain could taste blood in his mouth and his vision was going hazy around the edges. He would scream but shock had fully taken hold. He could only watch as Lyra timidly came toward him. Everyone's doing it, so I should too, right? She pushed the knife she held between his ribs. Blood welled up in his throat. Rain, you lived as a stain on our town, be glad you're being cleaned. Still, I'm sorry it turned out this way, I still feel bad, you should know. Lyra murmured. FLB. Whispered Rain, red streaming from his mouth. "Oh, does the runt have a crush?" said Myra. She giggled and withdrew her knife from his side. "I don't think getting laid is on his mind right now, Myra. I don't think much is on his mind at all, to be frank. Udlin, finish the little fucker off, he's gotten boring. I get the feeling we've attracted the attention of a few monsters anyway," said Brax. "Che, he was never going to be much fun. I mean, have you looked at the guy? He makes kids look strong." Udlin strode forward and with a swing of his spear he swept Rain's legs from under him. Rain crashed to the ground insensate and on the verge of blacking out. "Here, watch this. Watch me toss his ass." Udlin stabbed his spear into Rain's stomach and hefted him up into the air so that Rain was hanging like some grisly war banner. With a heave of his level-empowered muscles and a flick of his spear, Udlin sent Rain flying over the lake to splash down near its center. By the time Rain hit the water he was already dead. Chapter 2. Fate. Water. Dark. Silence. Rain gradually drifted back to some form of consciousness. It felt like it took hours. His vision remained hazy and dark around the edges. He attempted to look around. He couldn't see much. Far above, light pierced a rippling watery surface, but it didn't truly light the place. It was dark down here, far below. He belatedly realized that he was in fact underwater. It took only a little while longer for his fuzzed mind to realize that he wasn't breathing. Strangely, he found he didn't panic. He felt not calm, but near mindless, as though he was still half asleep. His vision drifted down and he realized he was floating above a human corpse resting on the lake. A corpse that had been brutalized and dismembered. His eyes wandered over it without understanding. "You." Rain heard a voice. He slowly blinked, or at least he tried to. No eyelids dropped down to cover his sight. This puzzled him, but not for long. It was hard to really be concerned about anything in his current state. Everything was just so unimportant. "I want." Rain's view eventually drifted from the curious corpse and across the sandy lake. Not for long did his eyes drift because something caught his eye. The corpse had caused a recent disturbance in the sand and something had been unearthed. A skull. Sluggish images of a wolf drifted across Rain's consciousness. That was what it reminded him of, a wolf's skull, but different somehow. Whatever. Kill. Was it the skull that was trying to speak to him? How odd. Sand years. Well, it didn't seem important, much like everything else. Rain was content to simply exist in this warm, mindless fuzziness. My people. Gone. Rain pondered if it would ever shut up or if he was doomed to hear meaningless rambling for eternity. The last prince. Rain felt the mild spark of interest the skull had created start to lose its tenuous grip, and he went back to examining the corpse. It did feel strangely familiar, but he couldn't place why. The sand was awfully reddish around the corpse. It couldn't have been a pleasant death. Avenge. Rain's musing was interrupted by what felt like a question inside his mind, one that he actually had to respond to. Not that he cared about the content, but he would quite like the feeling to go away so he could go back to his dreamful musing. He answered in the negative and the question disappeared. The skull stopped talking. Time passed and Rain could feel himself gradually slipping away as though he was moving to a more dreamlike state, somewhere else. Inherit. The skull's voice returned. It seemed to be struggling to get through to him. He didn't really have an answer as to why that was. More to the point, the annoying question had returned and was penetrating his mind, demanding an answer. If he could have sighed, he thought he would have. He decided that if one way hadn't worked, then maybe the other way would. He answered in the positive and the question disappeared. Peace returned to his dark watery domain. Rain settled back into just existing. Time passed. He noticed with mild interest that his perspective had changed. The corpse was closer. In fact, it was really starting to get quite close now. He felt whatever he was touched down on the corpse's chest. He looked around ponderously at this non-development. More time passed. He saw movement. Well, some movement. His gradual flow to the dreamlike place his mind was going before had halted to his mild annoyance, so the movement was a little more interesting than it would have been. He watched as little streamers of blood lifted from the sand and began to drift toward the corpse as though on subtle water currents. More interestingly, the sand around the corpse began to shiver and bleached white bones began to tremble and shift themselves free. Rain considered that whatever the bones had belonged to, it must not have been particularly large. He estimated it was similar to the body in size. Anyway, a march of bones began, bones gliding across the sand, all with the aim of traversing the sandy lake to the mutilated corpse. One by one they arrived and came to rest against it. The smaller bones didn't stop there, and they began to gradually burrow their way into the body's flesh. The last of the bones to arrive was the skull. It slid across the sand as though drawn by an invisible force, leaving a short grooved trail in the sand behind it. It came to a stop, touching the neck of the corpse. At this point things sped up. Bones burrowed and flesh rippled. The body seemed to unknit itself of its own volition, strings of flesh unzipped and muscle and vein bloomed outward like some kind of horrific coral. Rain had the vague sense that he was supposed to feel disgusted with this. The head of the body split apart, the skull fragmented. And the wolf skull was drawn into place. Flesh wrapped around it, and for a time the whole corpse writhed and shifted, and bits moved and repositioned and melded and reformed, like a sack wrapped tight around 100 wriggling snakes that deformed its surface. Bones lined up and joined where there were once arms, and flesh formed from the stumps to engulf it. It was all quite fascinating in Rain's mindless "oh, this is happening" sense of the world. As the seaweed-like fronds of flesh and vein and skin began to retract toward the corpse, Rain felt himself drawn downward into its chest. He didn't mind. Nothing really meant anything. This was just happening apparently. His vision slowly fuzzed and blurred and darkened until there was nothing. Babump. 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 Rain opened his eyes and immediately panicked. He was underwater, deep underwater, and in the process of drowning, his lungs were flooded with water. On instinct he shoved his legs beneath him and heaved upward with as much strength as he could muster. He shot off the sandy lake bed and rocketed up like a cork. The rippling surface light drew closer until with a rush of cold air he broke the surface. He immediately convulsed and a fountain of water exploded out of his mouth. He gasped wretchedly, barely getting air. He bobbed below the surface before thrashing at the water to bring his head above the surface again. Shore. Land. He needed land if he had a hope in hell of clearing his lungs. Burning for breath he spied land and struck out for it. He swam with desperation. More than once he tried to breathe, only managing half gasps that barely kept him going. As he neared the shore he could feel himself losing consciousness, nevertheless he dragged himself onward with pure adrenaline. Sand. Stone. Ground. He crawled from the water like a drunkard and collapsed. Half a second later he vomited water and then continued to vomit water. With shaky arms he lifted himself and water poured from his throat, from his lungs, his stomach. By the time he was done his inside burned from clenching and squeezing. But he could breathe, that was what mattered. He flopped on his back and took great heaving breaths. He was alive. Why am I alive? He croaked. His voice did not sound normal. He opened his eyes blearily and realized there was something partially blocking his vision. He moved an arm upward to move it away and somehow bashed himself in the nose. Confused he lifted his hands up to feel at his face, except what appeared in front of his eyes was not his hands but some kind of large furred paw-like things with white claws. He yelled and flinched away, afraid of a hidden monster. When nothing attacked him he paused and looked around. He was alone on the lakeshore. No monsters, not even the group he came with. The memory of what they had done to him hit him like a sledgehammer and he had to rush to suppress the memory, box it away. Even so he felt himself nearly lose it. He shuddered and squeezed his eyes shut for a moment. Step 1. What was the thing blocking part of his vision? He brought one hand up this time and, well, it took only a second of seeing it move to realize that he was in fact looking at his own hand, but become monstrous. No longer a human's hand but a cruel-looking paw, broad digits with paw pads, claws, even a thumb digit with its own pad and claw. He curled his paw experimentally. A quiet voice was screaming in the back of his head, but he felt like he had gone somewhat past the limits of what a human was capable of coping with due to recent events. He brought his hand, paw up to his face and gently patted at it. The thing partially blocking his view was his new snout, muzzle, nose. Not good. Alarm levels were spiking as his paws wandered downward where a mouthful of razor-sharp teeth became known. An animal's mouth. A wolf's mouth. He sat up and looked down at his body. His legs were no longer the nice and normal plantigrade human legs but a double-kneed kind of digitrade wolf leg, worse it was all covered in wet black fur. In fact all of him was. He held up his arms in horror realizing he was entirely covered in the stuff. Breathing hard and verging on a panic attack he crawled to the lake's edge and peered at the water. It took a moment to still the ripples, but as he did he saw not a human face reflected back at him but that of a threatening-looking black wolf with yellow eyes. He slumped backward and scuttled away from the water's edge. He tried to clutch at his head but the feeling off his paws just brought the fact he was a monster home. Oh gods, oh gods, oh gods, what is happening to me? He chose to close his eyes again to gather some sense of control. Breathe, just breath Rain, just fucking breathe. Inhale, count to 6. Exhale, count to 6. Inhale, count to 6. Exhale, count to 6. He remained like that until the sheer animal panic that was attempting to rise up in him had passed. At last, after what must have been nearly 20 minutes of calming himself and fighting down trembling gut-wrenching panic, he felt well enough to open his eyes. He was still a monster. But this time he didn't immediately freak out. Last thing I remember was hearing that voice on the lake bed. Gods, what was it? Something about a prince and inheritance. It made no sense. It might as well have been a nonsense dream if it weren't for this monstrous body. Blowing air out of his nose, he decided he felt collected enough to stand. This was easier said than done with his new legs, and it took more than a few tries. After he fell for the third time, he figured out that thinking of it as standing on tiptoes would be the equivalent anatomically as a human's heel would be the second knee of a wolf or a dog. At last he was upright, wobbly but definitely upright. He looked down and tried to get a measure of himself. Well, I'm still short, but at least I'm a little less short. He wasn't certain by exactly how much, but he was sure he was a little more above the ground than his past self. He looked over his body and found a black wolf tail hanging from his backside, currently soaked and hanging limp. With a discomfited feeling he tried to shake it, and to his surprise it responded. He suddenly had a thought and snapped his head around to inspect his groin area. He panicked thinking there was nothing there, but after a moment he realized what he was looking at was something like a wolf might have, a black furred sheath. He wasn't willing to explore further, but he was glad he apparently had something down there. He wasn't sure he wanted to know the details. As he acclimatized himself to simply standing, his stomach growled, painfully so. Fuck, if this is all new then I've basically never eaten. He looked around hopelessly. The shore stretched in either direction with no sign of anything food-like. Well, I can't do nothing or I'll starve, so I guess I'd best look for something. He picked a direction and began walking, or at least a wobbly drunkard's version of walking that half the time had him stepping backward to regain his balance. He made his way along the shore, leaving wolf-pad wet footprints in his wake. Chapter 3. Many wobbly steps along the rocky shore later and something came into view. It was the bloody corpse of a giant toad monster. Rain approached it warily. I guess Brax and his group continued to power level after Mutila after what they did to me and dumping me in the lake. Rain had strong feelings toward the people who had betrayed him, but addressing those feelings was difficult when his stomach was in constant gnawing pain from lack of food. The toad corpse didn't look like something a human would like, but he was used to eating horrible food to survive. Raw toad wasn't about to break him. In fact, as he drew closer, the enticing scent of its blood began to excite him, and he started to drool with the thought of getting his teeth into it. Unfortunately, something had gotten there first, or rather somethings. Several crabs looked up and glared at him from where they were chewing at the toad's flesh or trying to pull flesh free with their pincers. He made shooing motions with his paws trying to scare them away, but the crabs weren't having it. They snapped at the air and waggled their bodies around on spiny legs. Big monster crabs. Suppose that's about right for a dungeon. The crabs were large, the largest having a shell about a foot across, but that didn't deter Rain. He could smell meat was close and the hunger drove him onward. He jogged up to the nearest crab and with an awkward kick he booted it as hard as he could. To his surprise, it was catapulted into the air and landed in the lake with a kaplonk. Splash. Holy shit, I'm strong. This is incredible. Drunk on power, he snatched at the nearest crab and holding its leg he flung it out over the lake. It went far. Fuck, this feels amazing, he said as he stared down at his muscular arms. They couldn't be further from the skeletal sticks devoid of muscle from his past life. He could actually lift and throw things. He gleefully freed the toad from the crab buffet, launching crabs one by one into the lake. Then he turned on the toad for his own reasons. Food. He couldn't stop himself. He went at it face first and bit into its side. His razor-sharp teeth cut into its hide with ease and he ripped free a great chunk of muscle and flesh, blood pouring down his chest. He snapped at it, cutting and dicing it before swallowing as quickly as he could manage. Oh gods, why does this taste so fucking good? He whined. He leapt onto the toad and began using his jaws to incise into it, moving along its surface and cutting furrows. He groaned as he ripped and tore, trying to stuff as much of the meat down his maw as possible. He could only describe it as a perfectly cooked rare steak crafted by a professional chef, jaw-achingly delicious. A little voice worried at the back of his mind that being turned into a monster might have adjusted his sense of taste, but his hunger swiftly squashed it. 10 minutes later he lay slumped against the toad, his stomach was rounded having been so stuffed. Still, the mountain of toad was perhaps only a quarter diminished. He rested a paw on his overtaxed and taut stomach. He could feel it working. In fact, he could feel it more than working. He watched with shock as his stomach started to gradually shrink with a growling, churning sound. What was more, he could feel his body responding. He felt strange, a feeling like stretching when waking up in the morning. In fact, he aped the feeling and stretched out his limbs. It felt good, in fact it felt amazing. His stomach slowly diminished over the next minute or so until it returned to his originally flat stomach. He patted it tentatively. Tasted good enough that I don't think I can say no to more. I'm still so goddamn hungry. He turned and laid into the toad once more. A while later, and after his fourth round of toad, he collapsed in a puddle of toad blood and watched with fascination as his distended stomach slowly vanished. He stretched out his limbs and curved his spine as the feeling washed over him. This time he tested his theory. He placed a claw so that its tip lined up with a crack in the stone. It didn't take long. Slowly the claw pushed past the crack until it stopped a little beyond it. He was right. He was growing with each meal. Fuck, this changes everything. I'll take being a monster if I can become bigger and stronger. He eyed the toad but with disappointment realized there wasn't much left apart from bones and he had already cracked said bones to suck out the marrow. He needed more. More food. He looked around the lake shore. At some point some of the crabs had returned, ever the scavengers they waited nearby, ready to eat the remains once he left. Unfortunately for them, Rain had other plans. He casually sat up and glanced around. A rock, perfect. With one motion he leapt to his feet, grabbed the rock and then ran at the crabs. The crabs panicked and scuttled into each other. Too late. He landed amongst them like some kind of wrathful anti-crab god and began laying about himself with his divine weapon. Crash, crack, splinter. He cut down a dozen crabs in his hunt. The rest fled into the water, but it was enough for Rain. He dragged his victims into a pile and sat cross-legged in front of them. Strength powered by a hunger both for food and for growth let him rip apart their shells and tear free poffles of flesh. He eagerly cracked their claws and poured the contents straight into his open maw. One feast later and he looked down at his stomach with disappointment. He wasn't even 2/3 full. He scowled. Not enough mass. Tasty, but I need something more substantial to satisfy my hunger. He grumbled and got to his feet. I hope the crabs haven't gotten to more of Brax and Co.'s kills first. He continued along the shore. It wasn't long before he came upon a pair of dead toads, and something else that was a surprise, a goblin body. After smashing a dozen crabs with rocks he had the spot to himself and he crept up to it. This was the first time he had seen a goblin in the wild. The reality was far less dangerous looking than he had imagined but a lot more filthy. The goblin wore nothing but a loincloth and some beads around its neck. A deep spear wound in its chest was obviously the work of a goblin. Rain decided to ignore it for now and focused on the two toads. He salivated at the sight of them and his stomach growled in anticipation. I think this is the first time in my life I've been able to eat to my heart's content. Can't say I dislike it, he grinned, his lips raising to reveal his wolfish molars. He attacked the nearest toad body and shredded it with his teeth and claws, pushing hunks of meat into his maw as fast as he could bite it into manageable chunks. He was getting better at this, more efficient, but also more hungry. By the time he was done with his first meal half the toad was gone. His stomach was rounded like a beach ball, his skin stretched tight. He was fuller than ever before, having eaten more in one sitting than anything so far, as marked by having eaten half the toad, no small feat considering its size. Satisfaction rushed through him as he started to digest and he could feel himself growing. His spine creaked under the changes and his joints popped. He shuddered as he felt the tips of his paws reach a little further than before. Oh, this was nice. He barely paused as he leapt onto the rest of the toad with savage glee. An hour of gorging later and a wolf-like monster covered from ear tip to toe tip in toad and crab blood slowly heaved themselves up from the ground. Rain had no perfect reference, but judging by how far he felt his eye level was from the ground, he suspected he was starting to near 5 foot in height. Something he would have given anything for in his past life, but now he just wanted more. He eyed the goblin body. It's a bit human-like. But I am a monster. And monsters eat monsters, right? And sadly I've eaten more unappetizing looking things as a starving human. He scuttled over to it and sniffed hesitantly. Oh gods, it smells wretched, he cried, holding a paw over his nose. Still, his stomach demanded food, so he gingerly lifted up a leg and with the wariness of someone who thinks they are about to taste something awful, he bit off a toe, closed his eyes in apprehension, and chewed. That actually tastes pretty good. I guess the smell is just due to them having never heard of the concept of hygiene. Rain decided that he would rather get done with it as quickly as possible so he had less time to think about what he was eating. His overriding ravenous hunger was making that a lot easier than he thought it would be, although the little voice in the back of his mind worried if that was more to do with him no longer being human. Having practiced eating efficiently, he placed the goblin's hand in his mouth, pushed from the shoulder and began dicing it with his teeth, making his way along the arm. With a savage bite he dissected the last of the limb from the torso and the chunk slipped down into his stomach. I still prefer toad, I think, but it's a bit better than crab. He didn't slow and each limb went into his mouth until he was left with a torso. He grabbed a rock and split open the goblin's skull. He wasn't a fussy eater. The head is often the bit that gets thrown out at the butcher's as no one wants it, so he was no stranger to brains and eyeballs. It was just a fact of life, and when cooked, not as bad as one would expect. In fact, he'd heard they were a delicacy in certain noble courts. Here and now, though, they were fuel for the engine that was his growth. A torn open rib cage later and he was muzzle deep in the goblin's organs. Heart, kidneys, liver, even stomach and lungs, he ate it all. At last he stopped, stomach stuffed and nothing of the goblin left except his loincloth, marrow-less bones and cracked open skull. He had to admit after eating his way through it that goblin might be a contender for the top spot. Toad's days were numbered unless they upped the ante when it came to tastiness. Drool still hanging from his chops, he sat in fuzzed contentment as he felt his body surge with growth as the goblin digested to fuel it. He stretched his limbs and paws in deep satisfaction. As the growth waned, he caught a sudden motion out of the corner of his eye and leapt to his feet in fear. A goblin met his gaze for a moment. They had been hiding behind a rock and trying to creep past. Seeing Rain absolutely plastered in blood, they panicked and ran screaming. Ah! That might be a problem. Rain had studied the dungeon, he knew about monsters. Lynthia did have a public library after all, and he had spent many days secluded in it reading everything he could on how he might be able to fight and kill a monster and gain a level alone without help. That had proven fruitless, of course. Even the weakest monster, a goblin, would be able to kill him with laughable ease in his pathetic state, and that was assuming they weren't alone. Goblins were a pack monster, a tribal monster. Where you met one, many were sure to follow. He dashed after the fleeing goblin. He could not let it get back to its tribe and raise a swarm of the things to come and kill him. He suspected he would be able to kill one alone, even if it was armed, but as soon as more than one came into the equation, he knew that things would become increasingly risky. Facing more than one monster at a time was worse than facing a single much more powerful monster in many ways, simply because it's difficult to keep track of them, and being stabbed in the back was a constant threat. Keeping track of 2 or 3 and keeping them at bay in his current state? Maybe 4 or more. Forget about it. Many levelers died to tribal monsters simply because they do not have eyes in the back of their head. The goblin was a little shorter than him, thus shorter in stride, and his wolf-like legs increased that difference. They allowed him to sprint forward at speeds he would have only thought possible of someone with significant levels. However, the goblin had a head start and knew the terrain. He chased it from the shore into a cavern and from there into twisting, winding tunnels and caves. He was gaining, and as they passed from a tunnel he leapt and tackled the goblin to the ground. He held onto the wriggling monster as they rolled across the stone before coming to stop. It's the dire beast. Kill it. Squawked the goblin in his paws, which he realized by her voice was female, but that of course was much less of a shock than hearing her speak common. He looked up to see a trio of goblins sitting around a campfire, frozen in the middle of eating what looked like a roasted rat. Chapter 4. The 3 goblins round the campfire dropped their food and ran at Rain as he struggled with the female goblin, each pulling free from their belt a rusty blade of some kind. Rain made one attempt at breaking the female goblin's neck but was forced to give up as the weapon swung toward him. He kicked her free using the momentum to shove himself away from their reach. What looked like a poor attempt at forging a butcher's cleaver glanced off the stone where he had been a moment before, raising a flash of sparks. He scrambled to his feet and paced the trio. Get him. Useless shitty gobos, kill the monster. The trio charged and Rain was forced to back away toward the wall. Worst case scenario, multiple enemies, armed, and he had no easy avenue of escape. He racked his brain for a plan. Diplomacy? Come in peace. Kill LITTT. A rusty nicked sword slashed at him and he had to step back to avoid it. Another lunged at him with a dagger and he barely managed to move in time. He grabbed its wrist as they passed and swung them against the wall. The goblin was lighter than he expected and the monster slammed against it with a teeth-rattling impact before slumping to the ground. He blinked in surprise at how easy it was. The sword-wielding goblin took the chance and ran at him screaming. Rain reacted just a bit too late and the sword hacked at his stomach. He flinched in terror, expecting the oncoming agony and horror of being disemboweled again. He looked down, trembling, expecting spurting blood, flaps of skin, spilling intestine. But there was none of that, instead a trickle of blood where the sword had embedded itself slightly into the muscle of his abdomen. But that was it. Some combination of his stronger body and the bluntness of the goblin's shittily made weapon had saved his life. He roared in fear-fueled fury and snatched the wrist of the sword-wielding goblin. He swung him into the air like a ball on a rope so hard he dislocated the goblin's shoulder. He spun around, the screaming goblin at arm's length, and hurled him into the butcher's cleaver goblin. Flesh met flesh with a sickening crunch and instantly broke the flung goblin's neck. Both goblins went rolling across the cave in a tumble of broken bones until they flopped to a stop, unmoving. Rain, breathing heavily with a combination of fear and adrenaline, turned on the remaining female goblin. She was holding up as a weapon the spit the trio had been roasting rat on, roasted rat still skewered on it. Seeing his yellow eyes locked on her, she dropped it with a yelp and fled. "Don't you run from me, you fuck!" he roared as he gave chase. Another desperate chase through the cave system and Rain was soon gaining on her. The tunnels began to thin and become more varied in shape and the both of them were slowed. Still, his fury wouldn't be put aside and he reached out a paw. He grabbed, missed, grabbed again, and this time he latched onto her ankle. "Get off me, beast." "Never." She twisted and raked her fingernails along the top of his paw. It hurt, but it wasn't enough to make him let go. Unfortunately, his paw pads were still bloody from eating and were slippery enough when combined with her squirming to let her slip free. She jerked away and scrambled upward, vanishing through a hole in the ceiling of the cramped tunnel. Rain, blind with rage, rushed after her, got stuck, and after thrashing around for a moment he burst through the opening into a vast cavern lit overhead by a crystal formation. His eyes swept around and he slowed in dismay as dozens of eyes looked back at him. He'd popped up right in the middle of the goblin tribe's camp. Oh. What looked like a goblin chieftain, going by his size and higher quality clothing, stood up from a fire where he was attended by several other goblins. He was a good inch taller than himself by Rain's reckoning, tall by goblin standards. He held a hatchet in one hand, the metal of it in far better care than any weapon he'd seen so far. It gleamed in the crystal light. "Chief, it's the dire beast from the Great Lake. Like the witch said. It killed 4 of ours," cried the female goblin, running up to the chief. The chief used the base of his hatchet and clubbed her around the head. "Stupid wretch, why bring it here? Better you die than risk me." She whimpered and scuttled behind the growing group of goblins. Rain took a step back, but it only took a glance to realize he was surrounded. He glanced back at the hole he had emerged from. It looked ridiculously tiny from this side and he held no illusion that squeezing himself back into it would be anything but a death sentence as he was stabbed from all sides, unable to move or escape. His eyes roamed over the growing crowd. Only one real choice. If goblins were anything like levelers, then killing their strongest would be devastating for morale. More often than not, a leveler army broke and fled if their strongest died in battle. He would have to gamble. The goblins relied on their elites just as much. He set his feet and charged, sand pluming up behind his paws as he shot forward like a crossbow bolt straight at the chief, who appeared to have been taken by surprise by this sudden attack. "Stop it! Don't let it get near me!" yelled the chief, waggling his hatchet at the other goblins. A goblin with a spear leapt into Rain's path, The tip of the spear shifted as it tracked him. Rain didn't hesitate. He knew he would only have a limited window of opportunity to kill the chief. He reached a paw forward and then, as the spear neared, he grabbed the blade in his paw and tugged it back and to his side. The goblin, caught unexpectedly, was thrown off his feet and face planted into the ground. Blood gushing from his paw, Rain didn't stop and leapt onto the unfortunate goblin's back, where he drove himself forward in an explosive dive straight at the chief. He sailed through the air, claws outstretched and blood particles streaming from his fur in his wake. The chief screamed, hatchet held high, but Rain caught his arm in his paw and held it away as he lunged for the chief's face as he rode him to the ground. Razor-sharp reddened teeth puncture flesh, and with a savage twist Rain tore half his face off. Adrenaline pumped through his body and kept Rain going. Had it not been, he was sure he would have been frozen in horror by what he'd just done. Instinctively he treated his opponent as food, ripping and tearing, as he would a dead body. Terrified goblins began shouting and screaming around him as he crouched over the fallen chief. Suddenly something rammed into him from the side, and he was forced away. He rolled to the side and looked up to see a goblin even larger than the chief, a goblin rippling with muscle. By Rain's reckoning, this bastard had to be at least 5.5 foot tall, in other words as tall as a human on the shorter side. The muscled goblin roared and long strings of drool were flung from its yellow-toothed maw. Rain tried to find space, but looking behind him he found a wall of goblins holding bits of sharp metal. No dice. In front of him the chief stumbled to his feet, his face a ragged mess with only one good eye remaining. He held one hand over the gore, trying to hold what remained together. He pointed at Rain and screamed something unintelligible before staggering into the crowd of goblins. This is the worst case, absolute worst case. Gods, I'm going to die again, aren't I? His breath came ragged as fear built up. Mental images of being tortured and mutilated by a vengeful goblin chief if he was subdued surfaced in his mind. No, never again. He would either survive this, or he would die fighting. There was no other option. The muscled giant screamed in anger, beat its chest and charged, its crude wooden tower shield a battering ram aimed at Rain. Rain dove forward and slid onto his back. He raised his footpads and the tower shield slammed into them. He let the momentum carry the shield up and over, and then with all he could muster he powered his legs upward. The shield, with unusually large goblin atop, launched skyward and arced up and behind him. He and the goblins looked on in shock as the flailing goblin went up and up, then crashed into the crowd behind him, eliciting angry screams. It occurred to Rain that the goblins were not in fact unusually lightweight, but that he was instead greatly underestimating his own strength. He rolled to his feet. He wasn't sure what else he could do apart from follow his original plan, so he snatched up the spear he had earlier pulled from the first goblin to come at him and ran at the wall of goblins that the chief had disappeared behind. Panicked goblins tried to get out of the way but only ended up blocking each other. Rain stormed toward them, the spear acting as a lance, and he skewered the nearest goblin, then the next goblin. The weight of his momentum forced the spear through 3 more goblins until he had a total of 5 skewered on its length. He barely paused and shoved the screaming, howling line of goblins to the side, opening up a hole in the crowd which he dived into. A goblin dove in his way, a sword that was more rust than metal pointed at him. Rain struck it aside and it bent under his paw. His other paw reached up and tore out the goblin's throat. He pushed the goblin out of the way as it clutched its neck. He moved onward. 2 more goblins that were easily brought down one-on-one tried to stop him, but at last he burst out the other side of the crowd amongst rows of goblin tents. The chief was there, along with another unusual-looking goblin. This one was covered in blue tattoos and had piercings all over its wrinkly skin where it wasn't covered in rags. She wore a cuffed short-sleeved jacket different from the rest of her clothing, much more finely made than anything else he'd seen the goblins wear. The strange goblin held up a staff covered in bones and small animal skulls. "So, you have come at last," she hissed from between missing and blackened teeth. "Ancient memory has been passed of your kind and yours from witch goblin to witch goblin for hundreds of generations. We always knew your evil never left this world. No matter, long have we been prepared." The witch goblin produced an object from its rags, a wooden carving of a wolf with its head trapped in a cage. "See your end, beast." Eerie purple and green lights began to form and swirl around the carving, spinning faster as thick white mist began to materialize amongst the tents. "Yes, that's right, you stupid dog. Soon you will be mine and I will make you pay for what you did to me. You will beg me for death," cackled the chief goblin, prancing around beside the witch while one hand held his face together. Rain didn't like where this was going in the slightest and deemed it a good time to abandon the plan. The mist was swelling, enough to hide his escape perhaps. He turned to flee, but the carving abruptly began to whine, sharp, like a wolf's howl. The witch gestured and the green and purple coalesced into a flame that exploded forward like a lightning bolt and struck Rain in a fiery blast of painful light and white mist. Green and purple fiery shockwaves rushed up and down his body, burning. Well, actually that wasn't the case, realized Rain as he looked down at his body that was exactly the same and not burning or in pain at all. Whatever that just was had done nothing to him, at least physically. The mist gradually dissipated and he was left standing facing the pair. Excellent, crowed the chief. The witch looked slightly puzzled but raised a hand. Dire beast, you serve us now and you shall be the foundation upon which our tribe shall rise, our slave warrior. Come to me. Rain remained standing. I said come before me. Rain hesitated then stepped forward. He came to a stop in front of the pair. The chief was practically slavering with glee. The chief pulled a knife from his belt. I need payment for what he did to me, eye for an eye, well in this case more like eye for a lifetime of unending agony. Do not mortally wound it, I do not know of its ability, much has been lost to time about this creature. We have scant to go on. Of course, witchy, don't worry your little head, I've had plenty of practice cutting away bits a person doesn't need. His knife wandered down until Rain felt it poking uncomfortably at his groin. No problem castrating it like we did to the big lug, yes? That should be fine. The chief leered at Rain, his fucked up face making it all the more disturbing. Let's see how much spunk you have in you without your bollocks, HRMM. The chief started to press the knife, but then Rain's paw flashed up and snatched it from his hand and rammed it up through the chief's jaw into his skull. The chief flopped down dead. The witch stared at the dead chief, expression frozen in horror. Guess I'm not the dire beast. He gave her a wolfish grin. Chapter 5. Goblins on me, screamed the witch. The goblins who had been filtering around the tents roared and flung themselves forward. The giant of a goblin from earlier charged through a tent, one of his arms was limp, dislocated. Rain was pleased to see he'd had some effect. Spears and swords rushed toward him, he didn't hesitate, he grabbed the witch and placed her between himself and them. Her eyes widened and she began to scream for them to stop, but too late, a spear punctured her belly. Rain backed off as the goblins realized what they had done. Their howls of rage just rose all the higher as the witch sunk to the ground. She held her stomach wound and glared at Rain. The spelled trinket didn't work, but I don't doubt you're a monster just as awful as what it was meant to stop. She spat blood. The witch held up a hand and a fireball began to coalesce in her palm. Fire. Suppressed memories tried to crawl into Rain's mind, being forced to dance to Myra's fire while she giggled at his pain, the flames licking up his leg, burning his hands as he desperately tried to put it out. He found himself moving before he was even aware of it. He acted so suddenly that the witch didn't have time to release her fireball and her mouth could only hang open as he flew through the air, teeth first. His jaws came down on her neck and tore half of it away before she could move to stop him. The fire in her palms winked out as quickly as the light in her eyes. Mother rar, screamed the large muscular goblin as it stomped toward Rain, its bad arm flapping at its side. A calloused hand wrapped around Rain's neck, tearing him from the witch's corpse and slammed him onto the ground. The goblin used its weight to pin him, their faces were close, snarling at each other like animals. The crazed look in the large goblin's eyes made it clear he intended to kill Rain at any cost. Having no arm to hurt Rain with other than the one pinning him down, the goblin instead went with the next best thing. Its teeth. Angular yellow teeth bit down on Rain's snout, digging furrows and cutting to the bone. Rain screamed and struggled madly, trying to get away from the terrible pressure and pain piercing his face. His claws raked at the goblin's sides but to no avail. Out of desperation, Rain reverted to instinct. He lunged his head forward, forcing his muzzle into the goblin's mouth and then closed his mouth over the goblin's lower jaw. The bone held for 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, and then with a noise like shattering china the goblin's jaw exploded under the sheer pressure Rain's wolf jaws could exert. His teeth crunched down on splintered bone and teeth and he twisted his head, tearing off the goblin's lower jaw entirely. The goblin was left reeling, its tongue flopping from the massive gaping hole in its head where its jaw used to be. Rain pulled his feet back and managed to kick the goblin in the chest, flinging him off. The horde of goblins, seeing Rain prone on the ground, jumped at the chance and surged over him. His view of the crystals on the cavern ceiling was swiftly blocked by screaming goblin faces crowding over him, each goblin carrying something sharp. He felt metal puncture his side, his shoulder, his stomach. He roared in agony, desperately trying to get away, but the sheer weight of goblin flesh climbing over him and holding him down kept him from escaping. A knife flashed toward his eye and he ducked his head only enough for it to go through his ear. Now mindless with pain, Rain stretched his neck and tore out the goblin's throat. Again with the next goblin, 2 goblins flopped back dead. But there was more, so much more, and he couldn't reach any more necks. No matter. He could start with the extremities. He mouthed a goblin's hand and with a snap he severed it from the limb. He whipped to the right where a hand held him down at the shoulder. Snip. Forearm was now 2 parts, and a dismembered arm flopped off his shoulder. A nearby leg, bite, gone. A stomach, torn open. He bit down on a shoulder and crushed the goblin's clavicle. It screamed until he managed to get its neck. The dome of goblin flesh united in keeping him down began to crumble as the screaming spread. He freed one of his arms and pulled down a goblin until he could reach its neck. Another. Goblins who had been brave enough to hold him down as a team now panicked, and once the team started to fall, things turned chaotic. Blood splashed across Rain's body as he ripped and tore. A goblin tried to escape and his paw snapped out and grabbed its ankle, dragging it back screaming into the pile and into his teeth. He kicked his legs and struggled. He was stronger than they were individually, so the more their pin failed, the more his advantage snowballed. By this point he was freely snatching at limbs and dragging screaming goblins to his mouth as they climbed over each other, desperate to escape. Unfortunately for them, the press of bodies from goblins on the edge of the crowd made that difficult, so he had free rein to kill and kill and kill. Blood pooled between the bodies so thick that it came up over his feet. He crawled amongst the thrashing and the dying, seeking more life to end. Blood ran into his eyes, his vision was red. But he wanted more. Some time later he crawled free from a mound of corpses on his hands and knees. He was beyond exhausted and on the verge of collapse. He somehow managed to wobble to his feet and take in the damage. First he looked at the camp. It was empty, thank the gods. Then he looked at his body. A half-dozen knives stuck out of his flesh. His paw trembling, he wrapped it around the handle of a stubby blade embedded in his belly. With a keening whine he slowly pulled it free. To his relief it was only shallow. In fact, as he slowly moved over his body, plucking bits of metal from his flesh, he realized none of them went particularly deep. It seemed to be as before, a combination of the crude bluntness of the metal and his own toughened flesh prevented deeper injury. Still, it fucking hurt, and he was pleased to be rid of it all. He limped around and stared at the pile of goblin bodies. Some were still alive but unable to move, either due to injury or being crushed by the weight of their peers. He wanted to leave them, but he could feel unconsciousness flitting around the edges of his mind from sheer exhaustion. It limited his options. So with a stony heart he used one of the knives they had stabbed him with and gave the goblins he could reach a swift end. He dropped the knife and stepped away on shaky legs. He needed rest, but somewhere he wouldn't get stabbed in his sleep. He didn't have much choice. He made his way to one of the goblin tents that hadn't been damaged by the brawl and crawled inside its cramped quarters. 5 seconds later he was out like a light. Chapter 6. Rain blearily returned to consciousness with a groan. His eyes stung painfully as blood had seeped in, dried, and crusted over. He tried to wipe and clear them as best he could with the back of his paw, but it just made it worse. Scrabbling around blindly he managed to find the edge of a ragged blanket and rubbed his face with it. It helped, a little bit. With a pounding headache he slowly pulled himself up and crawled out the tent. He had to shield his eyes from the light emitted from the crystals above. He could have sworn that they weren't quite so painfully bright before, but then again maybe it was the headache fooling him. His paw touched at a knife wound he had taken. To his surprise it just felt like a normal touch, no pain. He examined himself more closely and found that he had entirely healed while he slept, and none of the cuts, scrapes, bruises, gashes, and wounds remained. He was whole. He was almost too shocked to process it. This body was aberrant to anything but some freakishly high leveler's body. There wasn't much to be done but be thankful for it. With one paw over his eyes he looked around. To his relief the camp still seemed deserted. He had no doubt that many of the goblins had gotten away and were most likely carrying a grudge. If he wasn't on the verge of collapse there was no way he would have chosen to sleep anywhere near here. Unfortunately it was what it was, and he was glad he had gotten lucky enough to sleep undisturbed. He looked down at his body and grimaced. His fur wasn't so much fur but bits and chunks of dried blood. Miserable. Gods, I don't think it's possible to be any filthier. I need to get back to that lake and wash off. He wandered through the camp. It wasn't a large camp, only a few dozen tents, but he supposed if some of the larger ones had more than one goblin sleeping in them it could keep plenty of goblins sheltered. He wiped at his nose and sighed, realizing it was plugged with dried blood. Blowing his nose and scraping at it with his claws managed to shift enough of it that he could draw air in. Unsurprisingly, he could smell a lot of blood, but on top of that was the stench of the goblins' camp. The bridge of his nose wrinkled in disgust. York! Do these goblins need to be as foul as possible? He wandered past the pile of dead goblins, much the same as it was when he passed out. It was a lot of meat. He could already feel his mouth watering, his hunger waking. No, not yet. I need to wash the blood and grit out of my eyes first. Maybe they have potted water somewhere. He continued onward and came to the edge of the camp. He found what he was looking for and then some. A small lake of clear water filled about a fifth of the cavern's floor space. With a whoop, he rushed toward it and splashed in. Cool fresh water washed over him and his aches and pains were soothed away. Blinking without irritating his eyes was an amazing relief. He sighed and shuddered as blood and muck left his fur, leaving a big red stain in the water that spread around him. Desiring something approaching proper cleanliness, he swam away from the mess he'd made in the water and began scrubbing. It wasn't ideal, but his fur was glossy enough that he was able to remove most of the dirt and blood using furious application of rubbing with his paw pads. He had to find a fresh spot more than once as he turned the water around him red. After the third move, he found the water was no longer being discolored and he stayed in the same spot until he felt he had scrubbed himself as clean as was reasonable. He waded his way out of the lake and shivered as water began to evaporate from his fur. He shook himself dry like a dog to hurry the process along. Drying fur was not a fun experience. It was in the middle of a bodily shake when motion caught the corner of his eye. He snapped his attention to it. It was a goblin. Just standing there. Looking at him. He snarled. "Fuck off. What do you want?" His recent experiences with goblins had left him with any desire to deal with the little green people again. He stepped forward threateningly. To his surprise, the goblin stayed where it was. "Look, I'm done with you. I don't fear your tribe anymore and I'm not about to chase you down. So you can go. Get lost. Go." He waved his paw at the goblin vaguely. The goblin seemed to hesitate. It looked behind as though considering whether to make a run for it. Then it seemed to make a decision and stepped toward him. "Why?" said Rain. "Because you aren't the dire beast." The witch was wrong. He blinked at the goblin who had spoken in a clearly female voice. "Wait, it's you, isn't it? The one I chased here." She nodded. "You know I was trying to kill you, right? I needed to avoid attention and couldn't risk letting you go." She set her lips in a line and nodded again. "I know." Rain dropped his paws in disgust. "Then why are you here?" "I wouldn't do this if I were you. Because you are strong and you think and speak. Chance you are the better option for me than dying remains of a goblin tribe." Rain was about to scoff at that, but his own experiences hanging on the coattails of others and relying on their goodwill made him pause. "I could just eat you. It's a risk, yes. But that is life in a dungeon. Life is always a risk. True enough, I guess. But what makes you think that I'd want you around me?" She seemed to be caught unexpectedly by that and spent a second thinking. Furiously. "Because I can carry stuff? Really? That's what you're going with? You know this isn't very believable. If I wanted revenge, I would consider fooling my target into thinking I am benign and then get them in their sleep. Is that what you wanted? It is, isn't it?" The goblin shook her head furiously, then with something approaching resignation she withdrew a small knife from a string on her hip and hurled it far out into the lake. She watched forlornly as it sunk out of view. Then she turned on the surprised wolf and marched toward him with arms outstretched to either side. Rain had to admit she was very brave. She clearly looked ready to die, but he wasn't about to start trusting her. "Stop, don't come any closer." She paused, then continued walking. "If you come any nearer, I'm going to kill you." She stopped. "I don't understand your motivations. Don't you want me to die? Look what I did to your tribe. Don't you care? I eat goblins, for God's sake. I don't care, not really. Gobos don't make tribes for ties, they make them so they can fight better. I was born in a litter of 5, we were left to fend for ourselves, my brothers and sisters all killed each other." She shrugged. The top gobos use us as playthings. The witch uses us for blood sacrifice and the rest of us backstab each other every day in the hopes of being one of the top. That's how it is in a gobbo tribe. No love lost. I don't think it is good. Still, they were your people. She shrugged. In the dungeon, when a big monster comes and kills us, you decide either to keep your head down or get revenge. All the gobos who like revenge are dead now. I see. She grinned. You should know that if I wanted you dead I would have slit your throat while you slept in that tent. Rain glared at her. Doing wonders for my trust here. It's true, even if you don't want to hear it. You're right, I don't want to hear it. Look, maybe you can stay around, but there's going to be conditions. I'm fierce, conditions don't scare me. This first one might. No, it won't. He strode forward until he was standing in front of her. She still had her arms outstretched. She looked up at him warily. He had grown taller, but he was still relatively short. Still, he was about 5 inches taller than the diminutive goblin who was on the short side for her kind. He leant down until his breath blew at her long, slightly curled black hair. You stink. With that he grabbed her by the arms and launched her into the lake. She flew through the air with a scream until she landed with a kerplunk. The goblin spluttered to the surface. Fuck fucking fucker, fuck you fucking fuckhead, fuck. Rain was already wading toward her and with fear in her eyes she tried to desperately doggy paddle away. Rain caught her by the ankle and yanked her backward, swishing her back and forth through the water until a discolored stain started to form around them. He dragged her away from it to a fresh area and went to work rubbing down the spitting furious goblin. Grab an arm, hold it out, rub his rough paw pads up and down like some kind of strange scrubbing stone until her skin glowed. Grab another limb, repeat, ignore kicking and thrashing. He got quite into it, though he did have another reason for being this callous. He was using it as an opportunity to search her for hidden weapons. Not that there were many places for her to hide one. She had a ragged shirt, he shredded that and it sunk into the depths. Loincloth gone, ripped off and discarded, breast wrap parted with a slice of his claw. She was butt naked and trembling in his paws as he moved on to scrubbing her back. He tried to remain as impartial and cold as possible, but he was quickly becoming more aware of her curves. That breast wrap wasn't for nothing. He let out a rumbling growl as she tried to scratch at him and she froze. He snorted and started on her hair. He doubted she had anything hidden in it, but it smelled like a fish had somehow gotten lost and died in it. The amount of crud and half-rotten food he combed out of her black locks beggared belief. He had to move to a new water spot once again just from hair gunk alone. He slapped a paw down on her head and dunked her under the water a few times just to sluice the last of it out. Satisfied, he made his way back to shore. You absolute scumbag. I hope you die. I hate you. Look what you've done to me. I'm clean. Spat the goblin in fury from where she remained in the lake. I thought you said you were fierce. She gave him a death glare. Gobbos are supposed to be dirty, the dirt is good. You can come out of the water now. Fucking dog, fuck. She grumbled, but waited from the water until water was running off her and she was shivering in the cold air, covering her bits with her arms and hands. Rain eyed her. I kinda thought goblins would care less about nakedness, levelers certainly aren't fussed. Shared public baths. That's easy for you to say, I have no clothes. He gestured at his body. I'm naked too, you know. She glanced at his body and Rain was amused to see her blush. That's not fair, you have fur. Rain scratched his nose and shrugged. I guess we can find you something. He wandered toward the camp again and after a moment she followed after him. You know, I don't think you told me your name. It's Opal. That's a surprisingly nice name for a goblin. I was expecting something guttural like RG. My name is Rain. Gobbos name themselves. Why would I pick a shitty name like that? Fair enough. Oh, and fair warning, I'm going to be eating goblin now. You might not want to be here for that. I want to see. And I want some too. Rain suddenly turned and stared at her. Goblins are cannibals? Yes. Why wouldn't we be? No monster doesn't eat their dead in the dungeon, that would be a stupid waste of resources. She gave him a slightly incredulous look as though she couldn't believe a monster like him didn't know that was the norm. Oh. That makes a certain horrible amount of sense. Rain found his way to the pile of bodies and began carefully picking his way through them. Here, strip each body I bring. You can take any of the clothes you like. If I catch you picking out a weapon though, I'll break your neck. I know, she grumbled as she got to work pulling off bits of clothing, belts, weapons. Reasonably quickly the goblin clothed herself. It wasn't until Rain pulled out the witch's corpse that she made a sound. She gasped. She was important, said Rain. Why yes. She wasn't one to be crossed. She could magic your skin inside out if you made her mad enough. I don't know, maybe she can do something in death. Rain kicked her corpse and it rolled over to Opal. Seems pretty dead to me. The goblin flinched away. Hey. Opal hesitated, then knelt down and began stripping her. It took a while due to the number of piercings the old witch had. She got tired of trying to fiddle them off and ended up tearing the rest free. She didn't hesitate to take the witch's jacket, however, and swiftly replaced it with the ragged thing she had found earlier. It fitted her well, a short-sleeve crop jacket open at the front, well made. If Rain was one to judge, it had been originally stolen from a halfling or other small leveler species and was not goblin-made. You can eat that one, by the way. She doesn't look very nice to eat. Oh, thanks, think I might starve then, grumbled the goblin, eyeing the unappetizing looking witch. Chapter 7. Sometime later the mound of goblin bodies had been stripped and laid out in 2 long rows. 22 bodies in total, including the 3 goblins who had attacked him first. He had made Opal climb down and drag them up into the camp one by one. At the end was the crown of the spread, the large muscled goblin which Rain had found away from the rest, where it had apparently fallen on a tent and bled to death, which wasn't surprising considering its jaw had been ripped clean off. You can turn away if you want. Opal tilted her head. She was sat by the fire, a certain witch spitted over it and slowly roasting. No, I want to see. Rain shrugged. Suit yourself. He snatched up the nearest body and laid into it, blood fountaining around his teeth as he took great bites. It didn't take him long. His teeth were strong enough to crush bone to fragments, simplifying the matter of eating a once living thing greatly. By the end, all that was left was a few bones and a skull. Rain let out a contented sigh. Regretting your choice to watch Goblin Girl? Opal stared at his stomach. Rain raised an eyebrow but moved on to the next, making quick and bloody work of it. He belched as he sat back. Are you going to keep going? Surely you can't eat anymore. Just watch. Rain rested a paw on his belly as it growled, then abruptly it began to shrink. Mass disappeared below his paw and he let out a grunt as the feeling of his bones elongating and thickening washed over him. He curled his toes and stretched his digits out, enjoying the addictive sensation. He turned his head to see Opal with her mouth hanging open. I thought I was seeing things at the Great Lake, but you really do digest that fast. Rain smirked. Well, if I didn't, I'd be here for weeks eating all of these goblins. Alright. He rolled over and moved on to the next goblin, quickly grinding his way through it, and then the next, then a pause to digest, then the next, and so on. It was when he was nearly halfway through the group that Opal piped up again. Hey, what's going on? Are you bigger? Rain finished stuffing a limb down his throat and turned to her. You didn't think I was just eating for fun, did you? I eat, I get bigger. I won't feel safe taking on levelers or bigger monsters unless I do. Goblins are one thing, but they aren't exactly heavyweights. You want to take on levelers? Said Opal, wide-eyed. Yes. That's minus. Do you even know how strong they are? I've seen a leveler behead a bear in one blow. I know. And that's not even close to what the top leveled can do. You're crazy. My tribe would only take on levelers if they were seen struggling with really weak monsters, and even that was considered incredibly risky. I guess I'll need to get strong then. Opal scowled at him. Hey, I'm not planning on just marching right up to the first leveler I see. I'm not stupid. This is a dungeon, right? Obviously any levelers that come in here are going to be fighting monsters at some point. I figure there couldn't be a better time to lay an ambush than while they are distracted fighting. I just have to sneak up behind and get them in the neck or back. HMP. Madness. You don't know this dungeon. Actually, you're right, I don't. So hey, there's something you can do instead of just carrying stuff. She grumbled but turned back to the fire and poked at the slowly cooking witch. Rain continued making his way through the line of bodies. By the end he was pushing himself and managing nearly 2 goblins before having to pause to digest. At last, he came to the end of the line and he found himself facing the big goblin. He eyed the horrendous scarring that covered the goblin, clear signs of long-term abusive mutilation. You really weren't treated well, big guy. I suppose that lines up with Opal's story about life in a goblin tribe. Well, I hope I killed the one who did this to you at least. Now you'll live on as part of me, maybe. I don't know if it works that way. Probably not. Avoiding the lifeless gaze of the goblin, Rain started on his arms. The goblin wasn't just taller than most goblins but also broader, with fingers like sausages, something that Rain found he appreciated as he ate. What few sausages he had managed to get his hands on in his past life were rarely appetizing, often they had a sheen of rot, and he had made himself sick more than once trying to eat them. Not that he had a lot of choice, it was either risk it or starve. Those who would feed him were few and far between. Most often charity came from out-of-towners who didn't know his story, and least often from locals. Those with a lot of levels and wealth were least giving of all, either afraid of the town ranker's wrath, or just uncaring. He held a petty grudge in his heart for that type of person. The way things worked tended to favor those who had connections and wealth, and as power and wealth are wont to do, it did not create particularly pleasant people. He tore free a bicep and began devouring it. I'm not the one to change things as much as I hate how things are, he mused while chewing. I'm just a bitter survivor who's become a dangerous monster with a need for revenge. And to eat. His mind drifted to fantasies of finding Brax and Myra and making them suffer for what they did. As he mentally played out his bloody revenge, he tore into the goblin all the faster, shredding it with his teeth, mincing bone with as much ease as muscle. He ripped its heart free and bit into it, causing blood to explode out the sides of his muzzle. Skull cracked and brains scooped, organs gobbled and ears chewed. By the end of it he was laughing. Just think of what he would do to them. He forced down the last bit of goblin meat, greedily gulping it down. Hey. Are you okay? What? Said Rain. Of course I'm okay, I feel great. You're crying. Rain blinked and realized it was true. He quickly wiped at his eyes and looked away. It's nothing. Just some dust in my eye. Rain ignored her and settled a paw on his distended stomach as it began to digest. It didn't take long before it efficiently began to break down what he'd eaten, growling and gurgling in the process. He groaned as waves of growth washed over him. This was a big one, and he felt his joints popping as they surged. He cracked his jaw in pause in satisfaction as his now larger body settled into its new size and his stomach returned to being flat and toned. He climbed to his feet and found Opal staring up at him. She had to look up quite a bit further than before. The top of her head used to come up to his jaw. Now it was about level with his clavicle. He'd grown a good 5 or 6 inches, he judged, more than when he had eaten the giant toads. Not surprising, he mused, considering he'd just eaten half a tribe of goblins. Big, said Opal. Rain scratched his chin. Yes. Still hungry though. I can fish. Huh. I can fish a little. Well, that works out because I need to wash all this blood off me anyway. Rain towed the goblin girl away from the pile of bones. He paused on the way, noticing that she'd only eaten part of the witch. Not willing to let a meal go, he grabbed the spit from the fire and walked and ate. Opal disappeared inside a tent for a moment and came back out carrying a fishing rod over her shoulder. Fish, she said. Sure. The unusual pair made their way back to the small lake where he made Opal strip again. She complained loudly as he spun her around, checking for weapons. Satisfied she hadn't smuggled anything from the dead goblins, he let the blushing goblin clothe herself. Rain lowered himself into the water with a sigh. He found washing wet blood off was trivial compared to matted dried blood, and he was soon clean and glossy-furred once more. Opal sat and set up her fishing rod on a large protruding boulder in the shallows. She deftly tied a length of twine to the fishing rod's tip and then a lure at the other end, to which she attached a severed toe from the witch. With a flick of the rod, the lure sailed out into the center of the pool where it gently bobbed up and down. She settled herself cross-legged and got ready to wait. Rain lazed in the water, letting the cavern's crystal light wash over him. He sighed. Do you think the rest of your tribe, the part that escaped, will return to this cavern? Doubtful. This is far from the only cave like this, and without any top gobos they won't have the guts to come in case you are still here. Most gobos fear their own shadow if they don't have someone to boss them around. Is that why you came to me? She snorted. No, I wanted a better life and I think you can get me it. Replied Rain, floating in the water with his eyes half closed. Just so you know, I'm not sure I can. My goals don't exactly coincide with a better life. Mostly they consist of revenge and killing. Revenge against anything bigger than you is not worth it. Gobbo life lesson. The ones who I want revenge on are certainly bigger than me. Well, that's only scratching the surface. They have levels, magic, I'm just a monster and have neither. Having second thoughts about being around me? The lure in the middle of the pool began to wobble and Opal took notice. Well, I figure it's like you said, I just gotta make sure you're bigger than they are. The lure plopped below the water and the twine zipped taut. Opal braced herself on the rock, leaning heavily back with both heels dug into a crack in the stone. She was immediately yanked off the rock with a yelp and crashed into the water with a splash. Rain blinked and then struck out toward her in alarm as she was towed away. He grabbed her ankle and heaved backwards, but he didn't make much headway as his feet slipped on the sandy lake. You've gotta let it go. Blub blub blub. Shit. He managed to tow her toward himself a little and got his paws wrapped around the fishing rod. He leaned into it and drove his feet across the lake again and again until great sandy drifts flowed in his wake. After a minute of thrashing against the sand, the shore started to near and footing became more stable as the water level dropped. He strode free one slow step at a time, towing the rod behind him. Water sheeted from his fur as he made it onto dry land. Behind, a shadowy shape below the water jerked back and forth, occasionally breaking the surface and revealing a scaled form. Rain didn't relent and began tugging and pulling until the monster was in the shallows and then up onto the shore. It was a gigantic fish, twice the size of Rain. Quickly. Kill it, said Opal, spitting water from where she had crawled onto the beach. How? Rain moved left and right, unsure how to approach the thing as it violently thrashed around out of water. Use a rock, you dumb dog. Rain shot her an annoyed glare but scooped up a stone the size of his head and rushed the fish. He brought it down on its head with a fleshy crunch. The fish opened its mouth and began screaming to Rain's distress. He brought the rock down again and again and again until the fish let out a wet gurgle and flopped down limp. Breathing hard, he eyed the fish, assuring himself it was actually dead. Opal patted the fish's side. Sometimes the tribe gets fish. Oh, that's a bit bigger than I expected. Rain's stomach growled and he licked his teeth. Opal rolled her eyes and gestured at it. Well, get on with it. She found a comfortable spot to watch as Rain let his instincts take over and he leapt on top of the fish and buried his maw in its side, eating scale and all. He worked back and forth, stripping the fish down to the bone from the top. He had to stop about halfway through to rest, his stretched taut stomach as big as a beach ball. He belched loudly. I think fish is my new favorite. Gods, it tastes so fucking good. Second place is toad, third place is goblin. Well, goblin in third as long as I don't try too hard to smell what I'm eating. Opal scoffed but wandered over to where he sat. She hesitated, then placed a small hand on his bulging stomach. It growled and trembled and then began to gradually shrink. Opal watched hungrily as he stretched his limbs, his bones popping as he grew half an inch taller. You like watching me grow? And no, it's just strange. Uh-huh. She withdrew her hand from his flat stomach as Rain examined his larger body. Uneff. I can never get enough of that, said Rain. His eyes slid back to the rest of the fish. Already he was beginning to drool. He crawled into the mess he had made and continued ripping and tearing at it, hungrily gulping more and more of the fish down. He made quick work of it, devouring it down to the ground until there was nothing left. He felt a pressure on his stomach and realized Opal was leaning on him. Hey. She only whimpered in reply as his stomach began to recede beneath her until she was resting on his toned abdomen and feeling his body shift and grow beneath her touch. She seemed to realize what she was doing all of a sudden and glanced up at him in horror. She scrambled off of him, blushing furiously and breathing harder than normal. Sorry. She ran away, snatching up the fishing pole and rushing back to the rock where she turned her back to him. He grumbled about personal space but decided to let it lie. He waded back into the water to rid himself of the awful fishy smell which to his annoyance seemed to cover him from tip to toe. Not surprising, but he was definitely considering knocking fish down the ranking for it. A few hours went by without the lure dipping below the water again, and Rain's paw pads were starting to get wrinkly. He flopped on a big flat stone on the shore to dry off. Hey, do you think that was the only fish? Opal hunched her shoulders, hesitated, and then turned to him. I think there were more, but... Well, the fish around here aren't stupid and the pool leads to other pools underground so they don't have to stay. When we fished as a tribe, it was rare we caught more than one big fish before having to wait. Sometimes that took days. Giving up. Opal sighed, then threw the rod down. Yes. Fuck fishing. I've got another idea. She leapt onto the shore from the rock and beckoned him to follow. He climbed to his feet and wandered after her. Chapter 8. The goblin led him to the edge of the goblin tribe's cavern. As they walked, a fine drizzle started to fall from the crystal formation that crisscrossed the ceiling. Rain held out a paw and a few small droplets landed on his paw pads. He realized belatedly that the goblins used tents for more than just keeping the perpetual crystal light out of their eyes when they wanted to get some sleep. The ecology of the dungeon was more than anything he had imagined in his past life. They came to the cavern wall and slipped into a small side tunnel. The light from the cavern crystals rapidly dimmed and vanished behind them. Fortunately, they both had excellent night vision, so this wasn't an issue as it would have been when Rain was human. A short distance later, Opal held up a hand and they came to a stop. She pulled a wooden device from a nook in the wall and Rain realized after a moment that it was some kind of handmade trap. Not hard to figure out considering the foot-long dead rat inside. Opal pulled apart the wooden frame and extricated the rat, removing a small wooden stake that had ended the rat's life in the process. Well, it's not as big as the fish. It's fine, said Rain, taking it in paw. A hungry person doesn't complain when given food. And I'm always hungry. He munched on the rat. As they walked, every 20 meters or so Opal would stop and magic a new trap from some crack or hole in the wall. Most of them contained rats, but 2 had a small lizard that was delicious if not very filling. You seem to have a natural affinity for caves and tunnels. Well, I was born to be a scout. What does that mean? I was born with some memories from Gobbo ancestors, a knack for telling direction, knowledge of the dungeon's shape, how to recognize when water is near, trap making. I was lucky. Rain blinked at her. Like you came out of the womb knowing this stuff. Yes, exactly. Monster tribal memory is powerful. Gobbos are born knowing how to speak common. That's why Gobbo babies are so annoying. They can tell you exactly what they are demanding and in great detail. I was going to ask how you spoke common so well. I didn't think goblins would have much need for teaching. We don't. Gobbos learn mostly from tribal memory. She shrugged. Maybe Gobbos could make a better life for themselves if they did, but Gobbos just don't make very nice or constructive tribes. I realized that because I was a scout and spent more time away from the tribe than other Gobbos. Was your tribe the only goblin tribe? Nope. We were the Great Lake tribe, just one of many, though most aren't very powerful. Ours was one of the deepest. Most Gobbo tribes prefer to remain near the surface. Less monsters and the levelers tend to be weaker and not as much of a threat. Do you think that any of those tribes might come and try to move into your tribe's cavern now they are gone? I think that. She paused suddenly and started listening intently, her knife ears twitching. What is it? Shh. She gestured and they moved up the tunnel. Toward the end, a flicker of light appeared. Warily they approached it, trying to not make a sound. They reached the edge and peeked around the corner. An open cave met their eyes, and in the center a fire upon which a rack of rats were roasting. Around the fire sat a half-dozen kobolds. Scaled lizard people, a multitude of colors with long tails and about the same height as a goblin. Opal tugged Rain back. You know, I was going to say who might move into the crystal cave? She hooked a thumb at the light. Those kobolds would. They don't like Gobbos. I don't like kobolds, nasty vicious things. They would love to roll over Gobbo territory. The light flickered off her eyes as she looked at Rain with intensity. What should we do? We should definitely kill them, she hissed. Kill and eat them. Rain gnawed on a claw. Alright, but how? I saw them. They have spears, and while I might have tougher skin than you would expect, I don't want to risk some fluke hit taking me down. Opal rubbed her chin. Well, they aren't actually holding their spears. They're on the ground by their sides, so if you can take them by surprise. What did you have in mind? I'll go round the side and draw their attention. You wait here and watch, and then attack when they are distracted. She shifted past him and vanished into a crack in the wall. Rain settled down to watch, an eye peeking around the corner to spy on the kobolds. They hadn't noticed anything, fortunately, and they seemed relaxed. One of them belched and lazily poked at the rats roasting over the fire with his foot. Stupid Gobbos, just leaving their traps out, grumbled the kobold. Weird though, said another. What do you mean? Well, I've never seen all of the traps full when we try to steal from them. Usually they check to see if they caught anything. It's like something happened to stop them doing the rounds. Sheesh, it's just Gobbo laziness, same reason we haven't seen any patrols. Dunno if I believe that. Gobbos are lazy, but they don't want to starve. Yeah, Something's gotta have happened to them. Maybe a big monster found them. We can only hope. The group cawed with laughter. Hey, I'm serious, said an indignant kobold, flicking sand at the kobold next to him with his tail. The target kobold spluttered sand out of his mouth and glared at the indignant kobold. Help, quavered a distant voice. Hey, what was that? Huh? I didn't hear anything. Help me. No, there's a voice, there it is again. The most attentive kobold and least lazy climbed to his feet and looked around with curiosity. At that point, Opal came limping from around a corner. She'd removed all her clothes and was buck naked, only covering her shame with her hands. Holy shit, is that a clean gobbo? Opal paused for a moment, hearing that, a look of irritation momentarily crossing her face, but then she regained control of herself and kept walking. Why's she naked? I don't know, do I? Why don't you ask her? Hey, gobbo girl, why are you naked? And why are you approaching us? Oh gods, it was terrible. A group of human levelers. They've taken over our gobbo camp and turned us all into slaves, even worse, they made us bathe. See. I told you something had happened. I told you so. Oh, shut up, Kiln. One of the kobolds tossed sand at the triumphant kobold. Okay, gobbo girl, so you lost your tribe, but that doesn't explain the nakedness. The L-levelers, they took all of us girl gobbos and oh, I can't even say it. You know what they do to monster slaves. I escaped when one of the men tried to pin me down and ravage me. Now I'm here. The kobolds grumbled. Levelers, tchh, they get worse every year. This is our dungeon, a monster's dungeon. They got no right coming in here. Even if it is gobbos getting killed, we'll be next on the chopping block. Well, what you wanna do with this one? Let's eat her. Opal let out a pitiful whimper. Eat her, huh? Said one, raising a brow suggestively. No, shoot up, I mean kill her and eat her. No. Please. I'll do anything. Just protect me. She scrambled toward the standing kobold and came to her knees in front of him, clutching at his thighs. I'll do anything. I'll be your rutting post. I got skills. I can suck the polish of a pommel. Let me show you. Hey. Get off. The other kobolds shook with laughter as the unfortunate standing kobold tried to push off her advances. Ahaha. Who bairn's gonna do it with a dirty gobbo? Have a bunch of half-gobbo kids. And no, I'm not. Get off me, you crazed gobbo. Mind, I've ever seen a clean gobbo, she's not bad on the eyes. Oh, you too. Wait till I tell your girl Kiln, she'll run a sword up your butthole just for thinking that. No, wait. I was joking. Nasty, ugly gobbo. Yuck. By this point, most of the group was rolling around belly laughing. Rain took this as his opportunity and slunk from the wall, padding across the sand as silent as a shadow. 3 seconds, 4 seconds, 5, he saw Opal eye him from around the standing kobold's thighs that she was holding tightly in place. Suddenly one of the kobolds happened to glance his way and the kobold froze. Rain moved. He shot across the remaining sand like a thunderbolt. Half the spears were collected on one side of the fire and he managed to kick them into the fire before twisting his momentum and falling on the nearest kobold. A flickering sight of a terrified kobold face passed his vision, and then his jaws closed around his throat and he ripped out the unfortunate lizard person's windpipe. Blood sprayed from the wound, arcing with his jaws. It sprayed across the nearest kobold from head to toe, paralyzing the monster with the abrupt and unexpected violence. The kobolds started yelling and screaming, pure panic making them mindless. Opal took the opportunity to push the kobold she had been harassing into the fire. The kobold screamed as the flame licked over him. She managed to grab 2 of the spears and throw them in with him. Rain launched himself from his first victim. He ignored the one who had been splattered with blood, better to focus on those who were trying to fight back than those frozen in fear. He landed on a kobold attempting to drag one of the spears from the fire, burning his claws in the process. He hit its back hard and slammed it into the sand, where he was able to get at the back of his neck unrestricted. He crunched down and crushed the kobold's spine, instantly stilling its desperate attempts to escape. Behind! Screamed Opal. Rain turned just in time to dodge a kobold carrying a smoking spear that he had managed to drag from the fire. The kobold roared in frustration as the blade tip missed Rain's head by inches and he tried to pivot to hit Rain with its shaft. Unfortunately for the kobold, a paw landed on said shaft and the kobold was taken completely by surprise by Rain's strength as Rain ripped it from his claws and smashed him around the head with it so hard it broke his neck. The kobold corpse flopped bonelessly to the ground. A burning kobold ran screaming from the fire before collapsing on the sand. Only 2 left standing. Opal was handling the blood-spattered one, or at least was trying to. The best she could do was fend it off as it tried to snap and bite at her. The other kobold had the only spear that had not fallen into the fire. "You bastard. I'll kill you." It charged at Rain and he dove out of the way. The kobold was far more prepared than its brethren however and pivoted to track Rain with the spear tip. Rain could only watch in frustration as the metal point punctured his shoulder, unable to escape its reach. He howled in agony as the kobold pinned him to the sand. "What new kind of monster are you? What dark abyss did you crawl from?" snarled the kobold. Rain struggled but just moving caused lances of agony to grind through his body. He was pinned like a fish and unable to escape or reach anything that might help. "Kiln. You need to tell the tribe. Tell them that oof." Opal, who had been backing away from the other kobold, bumped into the spear kobold's back. He stumbled forward and quick as lightning Rain's paw whipped out and caught him by the ankle and pulled him over. The kobold fell prone with a whoosh of breath, winding and stunning him. Not for long though, as the kobold felt teeth come down on his foot, and then he could no longer feel his foot, there was only pain. The kobold looked down in horror to see the wolf creature shoving his leg into his mouth. Already he had devoured up to his shin. He howled and tried to kick at the wolf monster's head, but it grabbed his free leg and its sheer strength held him as sure as iron manacles. He could only watch and scream as the rest of his leg disappeared down the monster's throat. Nothing could stop the sheer strength of those jaws, and they scissored up from his hips and began dividing his torso in 2. He blacked out as the black wolf's nose reached his sternum. "Hey, stupid dog. Stop eating and help me," yelped Opal. Rain shook himself free from the bloody gorge he had instinctively made of the kobold's torso and stumbled to his feet. His savage attack on the kobold had worked the spear free, but he still had to hold a paw across the agonizing wound as blood sheeted down his arm to drip from his claws onto the sand. He caught himself and blinked a few times. "Opal. Right." He glanced around and found the goblin wrapped around a kobold, desperately trying to crawl away, using her own body to weigh him down and trip him. Rain stumbled over to him. I got him. You can let go." He dropped a paw on the kobold's shoulder, but his blood-slicked paw in the kobold's smooth scales caused him to slip. He blundered into the pair, and the kobold, seeing its chance, twisted and squirmed until Opal's hand slipped off him. "No. Get him." Rain lunged and his teeth came down on the kobold's tail, closing like a steel trap. The kobold ran out the length, slammed to a halt, then kept going as his tail detached itself from his butt. Rain stared in confusion, detached tail hanging from mouth as the tailless kobold vanished into a nearby tunnel. "Gods damn it," scowled Opal, kicking the sand. Rain dropped the tail into his paws. "What?" The goblin sighed. "They do that when their tails get caught sometimes. It's an escape trick, like a lizard." "It's my fault. I should have told you they can do that." She crouched on the sand and looked glum. "Will this be a problem? That he escaped?" "Kinda. Not really. The nearest kobold tribe is a ways away. It'll take days for him to get back and organize a raid, that is if their top kobolds even want to. I just wanted to feed him to you and make you bigger." She made a circle in the sand with her finger tipped dejectedly. "Well, it's fine, 5 is plenty." He winced as his shoulder twinged, causing Opal to look up. "Oh, you're hurt." She leapt to her feet and rushed up to him and gently prodded at his wound. He hissed through his teeth. "Oh no. This is my fault. I should have distracted them better, or gotten more of their spears." "It's fine, really. Didn't you think it was odd that I wasn't injured when I took on your entire tribe alone?" "Well, I was, but I healed." "Gods, that's not fair. A wound like this would kill a gobbo half of the time." He shrugged and winced at the pain from moving his shoulder. "Let's just count ourselves lucky we came out alive. You didn't exactly get away unscathed either, you know." He gestured at a claw scratch across one of her cheeks. She smiled. "A kobold war wound is a gobbo mark of pride." "Sure it is. Now strip these bodies for me." He flicked the kobold tail at her leg playfully. She grumbled but moved to do so, dragging each kobold toward the fire until they were lined up. The kobolds, as Rain had noticed, had much better gear than the goblins. The spearheads were mostly unrusted and the few helmets they had only a few puncture holes. Opal was quick to nab a pair of low-waist cuff shorts one of the smaller kobolds had worn and wiggled her hips into them. Rain tried one of the helmets on but found that it was never realistically going to fit, being shaped for a kobold's head. He tossed it aside. Wouldn't have fit once I've grown a bit more anyway, he thought. Opal found a small coin pouch which she showed to Rain. It contained 5 small gold coins and 10 silver. More than Rain had seen at any one time in his previous life. Keep it. Some monster tribes trade, right? Plus levelers do, though I guess a leveler is more likely to kill us and take it than offer to trade. Still, hang on to it. Rain passed the dismembered kobold tail to Opal, and after he had eaten the remaining rats that had been cooking over the fire, Opal spitted the tail and set it to roast. Rain rubbed his paws together looking over the kobold spread. He could already feel his mouth watering. His stomach growled in anticipation. Do you think you'll ever tire of eating? Said Opal, settling in to watch with eager eyes. Well, would you, if you always felt like your last meal had half a day or more ago? Plus, I can't get enough of the bit that comes after. The growth. I need more. He dove on the nearest kobold and blood began spattering across the sand as he enthusiastically consumed it. One kobold down and he rolled into a sitting position and breathing hard, his tongue lolling from his jaws. His belly gurgled as it shrank down. Holy shit, that's spicy. My mouth feels like it's on fire. Too much. Hell no. I want more. Opal pulled the kobold tail from the fire and ran it under her nose, breathing in the scent. Gobbos love kobold tail. After a fight we divvy up the loot, top gobbos always get the tails. She bit into it and moaned. Shcof shucking G-shoot, she mumbled from around a mouthful of tail. Never tried it before? She shook her head as she devoured the tail. I suppose the top goblins would never let the lower goblins have anything nice when they could take it for themselves. Leveler society is similar. She nodded absent-mindedly in reply. Rain snorted a breath from his nose and left her to it. He moved on to the next kobold, which he quickly worked through. Even the claws went down his gullet to be digested. He noted he'd even started to eat bone he would have ignored before. It was just so easy to splinter and crush with his teeth, and it was more food. He liked more food. As such, there was little but the skull left by the time he was done. Hot. He was sweating with his mouth hanging open, but he didn't wait. In fact, he didn't even wait for his abdomen to finish shrinking down before he began forcing the feet of the next kobold into his mouth. The spiciness was quite addictive. Partway through his 4th kobold, he glanced up to see Opal watching him intently and surreptitiously rubbing herself through her shorts. Next time he glanced her way, she was blushing and looking away. He gravelled out a laugh as he polished off the 5th kobold, happily slurping up its tail and gnashing it to pieces before swallowing it all down. He belched long and loud and circled a paw around his stretched stomach. Opal silently wandered up and put a hand on the rounded surface. She watched with her lips slightly parted as it trembled and shrunk, making an impressive growling as sound as it did so. Rain groaned as his body surged, gaining mass, pushing outward and becoming larger, his muscles swelling in size. He shivered in delight as it finished, and then he stood up. He'd gained a couple of inches since eating the goblins, and now he estimated he must be at least a foot taller than Opal, a bit more even. The top of her head came midway up his pecs. She bit her lip and placed a small hand on his chest. It looked outsized. More, she breathed. Yes, more. He agreed. But not now, we should go back to camp, we can continue tomorrow. Why yes, tomorrow. He had the goblin girl pick out a spare change of clothes from the pile of clothing stripped from the kobolds. He used to be human, so he knew the value of having 2 pairs, and the kobold's clothing was much better quality than anything the goblins had. He almost let her take a spear but hesitated and decided to wait still. He considered picking one out for himself, but his previous life had provided exactly 0 experience using one, and in this life he was an instinctive master of tooth and claw, best to focus on what he knew. He checked his wound and found that while it wasn't fully healed, it had healed slightly and stopped bleeding, making it manageable. After burying everything and kicking out the fire to make the cavern look untouched, they broke camp and left. After a short journey back, slightly delayed because Opal insisted on sidetracking to empty the rest of the rat traps for Rain to eat, they made it back to the Crystal Cavern and the Goblin tribe's camp. Thankfully it remained untouched. Whatever monster tribe or monster that may have been interested in claiming it for themselves were still oblivious to its recent depopulation. Rain made his way to a goblin tent and crawled inside. He was pleased to see his shoulder wound had started to heal over. Soon his eyes started to drift and sleep took him. Some time later he awoke to a noise. He stilled himself and listened carefully. Movement. With one of his eyes cracked, he spied the flap of his tent open. Opal cautiously looked inside, trying to not make a sound, and then carefully, like a scared rabbit, began to crawl inside. That little bitch, this is it. I fucking knew it. This is where she backstabs me. I was wrong to trust her. Gods, I'm such a fool, and to think I was willing to let her close after I'd already died once from being betrayed. Why did I let her close? He watched carefully with a steely gaze, his paw tensing, ready to grab her and drag her close to tear her throat out. She raised both her hands, and he was confused to see that she was empty-handed. His paw tensed a little as he watched and waited. She crawled up beside him, ready to stick a hidden knife in his ribs. No, she was putting her head on his chest. Opal curled up beside him, resting her head against his chest, her body under his arm and curling her hand through his fur. She relaxed into him. Oh. That's why I let her close. Afraid to move and make her aware he was awake, he watched as she fell asleep, lips slightly parted. This isn't bad. Eventually sleep took him too. When he woke in the morning, she was gone from his tent and neither said a word about the night before. Chapter 9. Opal cried out in frustration and threw her fishing rod on the ground. Maybe they just left. You said the fish were pretty smart, murmured Rain, lazing against a rock with his paws behind his head and his eyes closed. Grr, I know, but it's been a day, the fish usually come back. I did kill and eat one of their own on the shore, that would scare anyone away for a long time. Stupid nosy fish. Fine. Let's go fishing at the Great Lake. Maybe they went there, or maybe there are other fishies in that lake to catch. Rain cracked an eye. We can do that, but I want to make it a proper hunting trip. We'll stay the night by the lake. Go and get a pair of tents and whatever else it is you need to put up camp. Opal glared at him but scampered off into the goblin tribe's camp. After a few minutes he heard her returning footsteps. He sighed and rolled to his feet. A large rucksack sat on her shoulders with a number of cooking utensils hanging off the side with string. She shifted her shoulders, making it comfortable. Well, the sooner we get to the lake the sooner you can eat. Are you coming? He eyed the rucksack. It very clearly held one tent, not two. Rain opened his mouth to say something, then paused as images of snuggling with the vulnerable goblin last night came to mind. He slowly closed his mouth. He found he couldn't make himself protest her choice, to his chagrin. Shaking his head at his own softness, he gestured for her to lead the way, and he followed as they left the crystal cavern behind. They left different way than how he had originally entered, but probably for the best, he considered. If he had difficulty fitting through that tiny entrance before, he certainly would not be able to fit now. The goblin took them through a maze of tunnels often lit by small crystals dotting the ceiling, but often enough in darkness, or sometimes barely lit by some luminous moss or other foliage. For the most part it was deserted, apart from the occasional scuttling rat which Opal attempted to catch by throwing rocks. She missed without fail, to her growing irritation and Rain's growing amusement. Eventually, they emerged from a jagged crack in the wall of the cavern that contained the Great Lake. It stretched before them for 2 kilometers, and the vast purple and blue crystal formation hanging above glowed with light just as impressive as when he had first come across it. He paused to take it in. This is where I died. And was turned into a monster. I hope it was worth it, Brax, Myra, Adlin, Eliza, Lyra. I'm going to climb out of hell and kill you all. Anything wrong? Said Opal, looking back at him. No, just bad memories. Let's find a good fishing spot. A rock or something that juts out into the lake. She nodded, and the pair began wandering along the boulder-strewn lake edge in companionable silence. Every so often a blue-shelled crab would scuttle from behind a boulder, and Opal would exclaim and rush up to grab it and then carry it back to Rain. Rain would then kill it and snack on crab as they walked, crunching open shells and sucking down crab meat. Hey, what is that? Rain paused from splitting open a shell and followed Opal's pointing finger. A large form lay slumped on the lakeshore. At first he thought it was a bleached white tree trunk that had somehow been beached, its top side covered in glowing moss. But as they drew closer he realized that it was a monster, an unmoving monster. An absolutely huge white alligator. Glowing crystal nubs dotted its top side, and its head was topped by a crown of jagged crystal which was ringed at the base with a worked gold circlet. Its eyes were white, blind. The pair stared at it slack-jawed. Holy shit, that's a big lizard. Think how much meat that is? Exclaimed Opal. It's dead, right? I hope it's dead. I wouldn't want to fight it, it looks extremely dangerous. Opal moved closer, and using a stick she poked at a leg. The alligator remained unmoving. Rain moved closer, even lying on its stomach. The top of the alligator must have been twice Rain's height. Round-eyed, he placed a paw on its worn and scarred scales. How do you think it died? I don't know, old age maybe. It looks ancient, there's even small plants and mosses growing on it. Rain looked up to see that Opal had abandoned her rucksack and had climbed on top of the alligator and was walking its length with arms outstretched for balance. The thing was so long that half of its tail remained below the surface of the lake. So it just dropped dead now. After living for decades or centuries? After I. What? Why does that matter? You're right, it doesn't. I'm more surprised that you didn't know this thing was living in the lake. You didn't, right? I had no idea this big monster was here. Although it's possible it came from an underwater tunnel connected to somewhere else. She shrugged. I guess if stuff like this lives in the lake, it explains why the witch didn't like us going in the water. Rain had the gut feeling that the alligator had indeed been living in the lake, a mindless guardian for the bones he had died upon. The fact that the alligator had something as obviously unnatural as a gold circlet made him all the more suspicious. He walked around to its head and with difficulty climbed on top of its snout. On closer examination, the circlet was definitely artificial, although tarnished and worn. It had strange angular runes marked around its side. The lines of the runes looked like claw marks to his eyes. In fact, he held up his own claws to the marks and could actually recognize the similarity. He gnawed on his lip and wondered what it could mean. What the witch goblin had said worried him. Her spelled artifact hadn't worked on him, but who was to say him merging with the remains on the lake bed hadn't been enough to simply confuse it, and he really was the thing that the witch suspected. Hey, are you going to take that or what? I don't trust it. It may be magical, may be magically trapped. Besides, it's fused pretty tight with the crystal. I'd have to break it to remove it. Opal gestured at the scales below her feet. No need to if you're going to eat the thing. Just eat all around that part. Right. He pulled himself around the crown of crystal growing from the alligator's head and stepped onto its back. Come on. Start eating, said Opal, looking at him with starry eyes. Rain rolled his eyes but dropped down and placed his teeth on the white scale. He began to apply pressure. And then more pressure. Perturbed that nothing was happening, he bit down as hard as he could. The scale remained intact. Well, what are you waiting for? Eat. MYTHICAL. He applied so much pressure that he felt like his teeth were going to break. He growled and stopped and then sat back, rubbing his jaw. I can't pierce it. It's like trying to bite a stone. What? It's true. This monster's natural defense apparently hasn't left it in death. He slapped a paw down on the completely immovable scales. Shit. Well, let's try a different bit, maybe the side. She grabbed his paw and they slid over its flank and landed on the ground. Rain placed his jaws on its side and bit, but to no avail. The scale wasn't even scratched. Opal, growing more frustrated, dragged him to a foot, and then when that failed, dragged him around to its mouth. It's simple, you open its mouth and then eat the soft fleshy bit inside. HRMM. Rain placed both his paws on the top lip of the creature and heaved. The head remained immobile. He crouched down and examined it. It looked like it might open, but the gap between its teeth and lips was a perfect seal. He scowled and tried lifting it at different angles. Nothing worked. The head didn't even rock. It remained eerily motionless, as though locked in place. What are you doing? Just open it already. I can't, you dumb goblin. I think the alligator might be a lot heavier than it looks. It's like how gold weighs more than it looks, like those coins we looted. It doesn't help that I'm trying to lift its entire skull too. It's not like I can get at its lower jaw. He sighed and sat on the gator's snout. I'm not actually sure this is even flesh anymore. It's almost like it petrified or crystallized when it died. He scratched at the scales with his claws. It didn't leave a mark. But it's right here. So much meat. It's just too stone-like. It probably is stone or as good as. Opal huffed and crossed her arms. I don't think it's likely to be scavenged by a monster anytime soon, if it makes you feel better. Opal looked a bit happier hearing this, although still grumpy. She stopped speaking abruptly and tilted her head, her knife-like ears directed down the shore. Then with her brow raised, she put a finger to her lips and spoke to Rain in a whisper. I hear voices, come on. She gestured for him to follow and she rushed to pick up her rucksack before the both of them scuttled behind a large boulder. Chapter 10. The voices came nearer and the pair peeked around the boulder. A group of 4 people came into view and Rain instantly recognized them as an adventuring team, one he had never seen before. He was uncertain exactly how long it had been since he had died, days probably, but he was still frustrated to realize that it wasn't Brax's group. He had hoped that his murderers might have stayed by the lake. He let himself relax slightly. He wasn't sure it would have helped if they had been Brax's. He had no way of defeating them in his current state. Levelers killed monsters all the time and he was by no means an atypical challenge for someone immensely strong like Brax. Yet, he didn't let himself fully relax. This was still a dangerous team of levelers and he intended to gather information if possible. There were 4 of them in the team, a male human, a male elf, a female satyr, and a female half-elf half-feline, that is an elf with feline features. No one Rain knew. He suspected they may have come from out of town as he knew many of the adventurers who made a home there. A pretty common occurrence as the town of Lynthia was built originally to be a stopping-off point before entering the local dungeon. People came from far away to get access to the dungeon all the time. What a monstrous alligator. We don't have to run, do we? I don't know, Belle. How would I know? Hey, stop. The male elf booted the giant alligator. The alligator didn't respond. Hey, that's dangerous. What would you have done had it been alive? Snapped the human. It's fine, I used one of my skills to check. Thing's stone cold dead, died of old age by the looks of it. That's the kind of thinking that gets an adventurer killed, especially when they aren't familiar with the local monsters. For all you know, it could have been hibernating and giving the illusion of death, or hell, it might be an undead. It's the right color for it. The elf pursed his lips but took a step back from the alligator. Look at that thing on its head. That's got to be worth a few coins. I bet the monster parts are worth more. High levelers will pay out the nose for good quality materials. I don't know, that is a fair bit of gold. I checked the sides, looks completely unmarked, no sign it was killed by a monster or adventurer. As the elf said, it most likely died of old age. The satyr wandered up to it and withdrew a long sword from a scabbard at her side. Good, that means it's ours. All we got to do is lop of a foot and take it back the guild as proof of our claim. Then we can come back with some pack mules and cart it to the surface in bits. Hopefully no one tries to poach it while we're doing that. She took a few steps back and swung the sword around a few times to warm up, then stretched her neck and shoulders. Finally, she raised it above her head and with a yell swung it down on the wrist of the alligator. Tink! Her sword snapped in two and the broken part of the blade flew off and plopped into the lake. Oh my god, my sword! What? What happened? My sword? Do you even know how much I paid for this? The satyr hopped up and down on the spot in pure rage. Well, it can't have been very much if it broke like a cheap piece of tin. It was enchanted surefire steel, damn you. Well damn. Maybe you got scammed. Arghhh. Look, just let me handle it, I have more levels than you anyway, said the human as he unhooked an axe, one of two, from his back. The satyr glared at him as she cradled her broken sword like a wounded child. It's not gonna work. The man rolled his eyes and without preamble heaved his axe down on the alligator's wrist. The axe head promptly shattered and chunks of metal exploded across the ground. This thing is made out of bullshit, screamed the man. I told you. I told you so. But would you listen? No, nobody listens to the satyr. Just a dumb drunkard species who needs their advice. You just had to try it, didn't you? Shut up. Shut up. I am higher level than you and I demand you shut up. Please, you too, said the half-elf calmly. It's pretty clear that this monster is extraordinarily strong or under some unknown effect now it is dead. I doubt anything less than Lynthia's rancor would be able to cut its body. Then what do we do then? We found it. I don't see that there is much we can do. If we get the town's rancor involved, he will no doubt steal it from us and we won't be able to say a word against him as he is significantly higher level than we are. So, what? We just destroyed our weapons for nothing. The calm half-elf pursed her lips. I don't see any other way it can be interpreted. The most we can expect is a reimbursement from the guild for the information, that is if someone else hasn't already told them. We appear to have little or nothing. The male elf groaned. Why did I choose to team up with you idiots? Because no one else would take your sorry ass. Go orgy yourself, satyr girl. Hey. That's speciest. I don't know, is it? Yes. It's a stereotype. Satyrs don't just do orgies, you know. They mostly do, let's be honest. Okay, granted, but still. The man sighed and rubbed a hand over his face. Or at least that would be the case, continued the half-elf. If there were not a rather large chunk of what looks like pure gold, gold that is soft enough to cut, attached to the alligator's head. The four adventurers looked up at the circlet in silence. Well, who wants to try and remove it? Not me, grumbled the satyr. Might be magicked. I've already lost one expensive thing today. The human and the half-elf shared a look. Oh, you bunch of pansies, spat the elf as he jumped up on the alligator's snout. He strode forward and unsheathed a dagger at his side before stabbing it into the circlet. The circlet immediately exploded. The elf was blown off the alligator and slammed into a nearby boulder where he slid to the ground, the shield on his back having cracked the stone he hit so hard. Pieces of gold were flung in all directions, mostly far over the lake, the rest cracked against any nearby stone with enough force to make sparks. The satyr flung herself to the ground with a yelp. The half-elf rushed to the side of the male elf who had been catapulted by the explosion and began checking him over. Green light suddenly shone from her hands as her feline tail lashed behind her. After a moment of this, the male elf groaned and woke up. I'm not saying anything. Not saying anything at all. My wine-loving lips are sealed, said the satyr from prone on the ground. I think I made a silly mistake, moaned the elf. The half-elf sighed. You're fine. A few broken ribs, but I've already fixed them. Next time don't be so reckless. You're so stupid lucky we have a healer on the team, said the man. Not exactly a common class. The elf groaned but held up a shaking hand within which he held a good eighth of the circlet. Just take my sacrifice into account when we split the loot. Pish you wish. The team busied themselves with picking up the shattered chunks of gold. There wasn't as much as they were hoping, maybe a quarter in total, less than they expected having seen how much came down on land. The satyr stared forlornly over the lake's dark waters. This has been mostly a complete disaster. Look, I'm going to go find some monsters to kill with my one remaining axe so I can grind out a level up. Come with me, said the man. The satyr scowled at him but gestured her agreement. Wait, let me make a note claiming we found the monster body first. The half-elf pulled a piece of paper and ink from her satchel and scratched out a note. She then tucked it in between the alligator's lips so that it hung down limp. All our names right? Yes. You know my name spelt with AK, right? Yes, said the half-elf slightly more forcefully. Alright, fine, let's go. Chapter 11. Opal held up her hands and showed all the gold she had filched from the adventuring team as they looked to pick up what had been scattered across the shore. That's a lot of gold. I'm the one who has to carry it. You did say that was what you were good at. Opal set her lips in a line but didn't reply. We're going to follow them. I want to see what else they do, and I want information about other adventurers, so we'll eavesdrop when we can, though this lot seem, a bit clueless. I've never seen such a useless bunch of idiots in my life, grumbled the goblin. I doubt we saw them at their best. They made it this far down into the dungeon, so they are likely fairly high level. They set out after the adventurers, using the boulders for cover as they went, but not before Opal pulled off the note on the alligator, balled it up, and threw it in the lake. They kept their distance but not far enough that Rain couldn't overhear the group. This place where we're headed, you've been there before? Asked the satyr. Yes, replied the man. A couple of times. It's easy pickings for leveling if you know what you are doing, and I do know what I'm doing. You've already lost one of your axes, so excuse me, I have my doubts about that. Funny words from an elf that got blown off his ass and nearly broke his only shield. If you must know, I am perfectly fine fighting with one axe. And Belle? The satyr drew a shorter blade from a smaller sheath below the one that had contained her long sword. She spun the broken sword and the short sword, one in each hand. I'll manage. The elf threw his hands up in the air. Fine. Don't blame me when things go wrong. We already did that when you blew half our loot into the lake. Not my fault. Oh, it most certainly was. Like you lot would have come up with anything better to remove it. We were going to lose some of the gold no matter what. We could have prepared. I don't know, maybe you could have covered in something to catch the gold before touching it. Look, I-. Shh. Did you see that? Said the satyr. What? I saw something, a black furred thing in the shadows, behind us. I don't see anything. I'm sure there was something. Let's just take care, something might be stalking us. The axe-wielding man grunted. We'll report it when we get back to the guild, but it's probably one of those wild dogs. They like to follow adventurers. Got black fur, not a threat. I don't know. I'm sure it was bipedal, it was walking on 2 legs. Yeah. The place is just through here. The man gestured before leading the group inside a crack in the cavern's wall. Opal leaned back as she watched them go in. They almost saw you. You gotta be more careful. Rain grunted in reply. The pair followed the team through the crack, though a craggy tunnel, and then down where it opened up into a massive cavern. Rain looked on in awe at the underground forest that was revealed. Shallow rolling hills gave the appearance of waves as the ancient treetops fell and rose, mist climbing between the slopes. The jagged ceiling was marked with a spattering of minor crystal as well as carpets of glowing moss, giving the cavern an ethereal atmosphere. They'd come out on a small open plateau that overlooked all this. Ahead, the adventuring team had begun to climb down. Opal suddenly grabbed his paw and dragged him down behind a rock. It's just a forest, why are you staring? They're gonna see you just standing there like that. It's a forest underground. She gave him a curious look. So, that's pretty common for dungeons. Right. The pair dropped down from the shallow plateau and slunk into the woods, then came to a slow stop as the adventuring team stepped out into a clearing. Ahead of them, dotted across the grass, were several enormous 7-foot-tall mushrooms. Fat white trunk-like bodies with blood-colored caps and black markings. They seemed to shift slightly in the breeze, which was odd. Rain realized as there was no breeze. The elf spread his arms. There's nothing here. Gods, what a waste of time. Oh, shut up already. Look, said the man. He picked up a rock and tossed it overarm at the nearest mushroom where it glanced off its side. The mushroom shuddered to life and stood up upon a pair of chunky stump legs before spinning around looking for what had attacked it. 2 beady black eyes fixated on the team, and the mushroom roared, a long vertical line splitting down its middle to reveal a maw full of jagged triangular teeth. The mushroom charged. It was shockingly fast on its stumpy legs, nearly as fast as a human running, using its sheer strength to propel itself. Oh great. Now we're hunting vegetables, grumbled the elf. What vegetables are you eating that have teeth? The man spun his axe and, ready to take on the oncoming mushroom, the satyr and the elf stepped up either side of him, and the half-elf held up her crystal-tipped wooden staff behind them, its tip swirling with oily colors. The man roared and swung his axe. An arc of fire exploded from its edge and slashed into the mushroom, carving and burning a long wound up its trunk. The mushroom stumbled and the satyr danced forward on nimble hooves, her blades spinning through the air, eager to dice and slice. She came into contact, and the short stubby arms on either side of the mushroom were severed and flicked into the air, and then with a thunk 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 its cap started to fall to pieces as metal met shroom flesh. The mushroom slowed and then ponderously toppled over. You see? It's easy. Just don't let them get a bad angle and they're easy experience. Yaha! Cheered the satyr standing on top of the fallen mushroom. You didn't let me hit it, you dumb satyr. I didn't get anything. Oh, quit your whining, you had your chance. He has a point, we need to allow each of us to attack it before killing it so we can all level. That includes our healer. It's fine, I gain levels residually from buffing you, said the half-elf, smiling serenely. Oh, right. Well, anyway. The man picked up another stone and bounced it off a nearby mushroom. The stone bounced far enough that it struck a second mushroom close by. It bumbled to its feet and followed after the first mushroom that was now heading toward the team. Don't panic, everyone. I've been here enough times, even 2 or 3 can be dealt with. Just follow my lead and watch your footing. The team began moving up and around the pair of mushrooms, maneuvering them into an advantageous position or kiting them. Opal turned to Rain. I want to try something, but I need you to climb a tree. Rain raised an eyebrow. It'll make sense, I promise. Look, this tree is perfect. Please. Rain frowned but reluctantly began climbing the tree. He was pleased to note how easy it was. Having outsized strength like a leveler had its benefits. Opal disappeared into the foliage and he settled down to watch. The adventuring team, despite the occasional spat with each other, seemed to function well. They kept the angry mushroom creatures well controlled and led them into positions advantageous to themselves, where they flanked them so as to avoid their dangerous maws. Rain watched with interest as they wandered around the clearing, drawing the attention of each dormant mushroom and then cutting it down. They were about halfway through this when the foliage at the edge of the clearing began to shake and a new mushroom jumped out and charged toward the group. "Watch it. We've got a stray," yelled the axe wielder, pivoting to face it. "Where did that come from? We haven't thrown a rock anywhere near that part of the wood. It must have been awoken as we walked in here and gotten stuck on a tree or something. It came from the same direction. No matter, it's just more levels." Sure. The group evolved tactics and added the new mushroom to their strategy. They were adapting quite well until 2 more mushrooms burst from the tree line behind them. Then 3 more. Then 5 more. What is happening? Why are they coming out of the wood for us? I don't know. This hasn't happened any time I've been here before. I assume something is in the woods awakening them and directing them to us. Fuck. I bet it was that black thing that was shadowing us earlier. It knows we're vulnerable. It was just waiting to get us. Calm down, don't panic. We just need to retreat to the plateau while stopping them from getting close. They won't be able to climb up it with those stubby legs and we'll be safe. Stay together, on me." The group formed up and began to retreat in an orderly fashion as more and more of the furious mushroom monsters lumbered into the clearing. They were doing well, using a combination of hit and run tactics to keep the shrooms at a distance and using their positioning to cause the shrooms to trip over each other. In fact, they looked like they were going to make it, up until a dozen mushrooms burst out of the tree line that they were trying to flee into. Rain watched with interest as Opal danced past silently below, avoiding the eyes of the apparently narrow-sighted mushroom creatures and directing their attention to the clearing with tossed sticks and stones. "This all your fault, you damned human," screamed the male elf as he used his shield to desperately keep away the teeth of a shroom. The man caved its cap in with a mighty blow of his axe. "It's fine. Everything's fine. We're going to make it. Look out," cried the satyr as a surge of mushrooms climbed over each other to get at them. There's too many." A particularly tall and aggressive mushroom abruptly clambered over the pile of dead and lunged at the elf. The elf, eyes going round, tried to stop it with his shield, but too late, it closed on him, its maw open wide. The elf panicked and with a cry shoved his shield into the monster's mouth before turning and running. The mushroom barely noticed the shield, letting it drop free and instantly charging after him, swiftly gaining ground. "And no. Get away. Get the fuck away from me." He ran at the half-elf and grabbed her by the shoulders and then to the rest of the teams, and Rain's shock, he turned and threw her at the mouth of the chasing mushroom, which closed shut like a guillotine, removing her head and part of her shoulder from her body. She had only had a moment to cry out before she was permanently silenced. "No!" screamed the satyr. "Damn you, Orden. Damn you to hell!" roared the man. The fight descended into chaos as the elf fled into the woods. The man and satyr held on valiantly, but it was clear they were fighting a losing battle. The mushrooms rolled over the two and they became fully surrounded, almost disappearing from Rain's sight. "Belle, this is my fault, I'm going to make space. When I'm done, go, don't think of anything else." He stepped forward and roared, axe held high. Blue fire engulfed the head of the axe and then washed over his body, entirely covering him in flame. He charged the mushrooms as flares of blue fire erupted from his body in all directions, reaching for meters. Many of the mushrooms ignited or tried to flee the terrible fire. The satyr, taking her chance, raced through the gap made by the man as he fell to his knees. She darted into the forest as the man collapsed to the ground, a burning azure pyre. Chapter 12. Sometime later, Rain climbed down from the tree and wandered into the clearing. Dead mushroom monsters littered the ground. He counted 16. The other surviving mushrooms had wandered off into the forest. "Damn it, I only got 2 of them, and one of them got turned into ash," grumbled Opal, appearing at his side. "That was a pretty clever plan, but I'm not sure I wanted them dead." She glared up at him. "I did it so you can eat them." Whoa, I'm not eating levelers." "What? Why not?" I'm just not okay. Look, help me with these mushroom monsters. Go grab the bits that satyr chopped off. And get that half-elf's body out of my sight." The goblin gave him a suspicious look but started to do as he said as he stepped over to the nearest mushroom. He had yet to eat today, so he was especially ravenous. Drool was already starting to drip from his mouth and his stomach growled irritably. Without preamble, he leapt on the mushroom and ripped a mouthful of mushroom flesh free. It parted easily beneath his teeth and he was able to consume it swiftly. 2 bites, 4 bites, 6, he gorged on mushroom, but rapidly began to slow and then come to a stop. Bland. Oh gods, why is this so bland? Ugh. He tried rolling the mushroom around in his mouth, scenting it, swallowing it quickly, but to no avail. The food remained unbelievably bland and papery, like eating a block of tasteless plant fiber. To the bottom of the ranking with you, he growled as he mentally placed it below anything he had eaten so far. He looked down at the masses of mushroom bodies with dismay and slumped his shoulders. Well, the sooner I'm done, the sooner I can find something appetizing to eat, he sighed. He went back at it, this time with significantly less enthusiasm. 10 minutes later he had managed most of the first mushroom monster and was beginning to digest. He curled his toes in anticipation and stretched his claws out along with his arms. His stomach gurgled and then began to shrink down. He closed his eyes waiting for the feeling to hit. And waited. And then a feeble sense of growing rolled through him, barely a whisper. He opened his eyes. Is that it? This stuff is terrible. It's food, it should make you bigger, yes. Why isn't it? Said Opal from where she had been watching. Yes, it should, but I am like a wolf, a carnivore, so maybe whatever causes me to grow doesn't work as well with, not meat. Carnivores don't fight their way up the food chain to eat vegetables. Opal raised her arms up and looked at the huge pile of mushroom flesh she had pushed together and then dropped them and sighed. You grew, you definitely still grew, right? Yeah, a little bit. It's enough to make me want to eat the rest. Even though I hate myself for it. He went back to eating. And eating. And eating. At some point he had given up speeding through it and had resigned himself to a miserable grind. An hour later he found himself on his back as Opal pushed mushroom bodies and limbs toward him. He genuinely began to wonder if it would ever end, but eventually the last chunk of bland mushroom was choked down. He estimated he'd gained less than an inch of height even after eating so many. GGHHHH. If I ever see a mushroom again it will be too soon. But I can find a live one in the woods and you can kill it. They've gone dormant again so I will have to go throw sticks and stones too. Wake one up and lead it here, it's food, that's good, right? No. I don't know if I can kill them, and even if I could it would only make me grow a tiny bit, not worth it. It's better to go find real meat. We do have real meat, you know. That meat being the half-elf. You should eat her. I don't want to. But why? She's dead, she won't care. She's not a monster. But I'm a monster. We both are. We're different. How? I think and feel just like her. You were happy to kill and eat so many goblins just like me. The only difference between us and them is that they have the ability to level by killing monsters. Gods, let me look at the body. Opal grinned wickedly and grabbed him by the paw and towed him through the trees to the small plateau. It was covered in roots for handholds so they had no trouble scrambling up its side. On top the goblin led him to where she had made camp while Rain had been eating. The body of the half-elf half-Felice was laid out and stripped naked nearby as though prepared for Rain. He gave the goblin an annoyed look, she'd never intended to let him avoid it. The half-elf had been bisected from armpit to neck across the clavicle. Her eyes stared sightlessly up at the cavern ceiling. She had the typical eerily perfect elven features, but along with that she had tipped cat ears poking from her long hair, a cat tail, and where she would have had ordinary elven legs she instead had fur digitrade cat legs, her pale skin transitioning into white cat fur about 6 inches down her thigh. Rain grimaced. He'd known a number of elves and half-elves in his previous life. They strictly went into the people category whereas goblins were obviously monsters. Of course, his current situation was forcing him to rethink things. Monsters were a lot more people-like than he had imagined. It made him doubt everything he'd been taught. This is the way of animals and monsters. Once something is dead it is dead and nothing but food to keep others alive. Arrogant levelers just like to pretend they are different. If you don't eat her some other monster will. Just eat a bit, you'll see it's the same as anything else. Opal held up one of the half-elf's hands and Rain dropped to his knees and took it in his paws. He eyed the hand. This hand had held a magic staff once. It had protected and healed people. Now it was nothing but meat. Like at the butcher's shop. It was only the preconceptions of his past life that stopped him. He was a monster now. Things were different. His new monstrous instincts were roaring in his ear. Eat. 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 This is food, you need food, you are a beast, a monster. You live to eat. You eat to live. Devour. Fuck. He bit down on the hand and severed her fingers, Blood exploded in his mouth, washing away the taste of bland mushroom and setting sparks of flavor dancing across his tongue. Oh no, she's delicious. He couldn't control himself and he tore into the half-elf like a ravenous wolf, consuming her from fingertip to shoulder in seconds, bone and all, then savagely rending flesh with whetted teeth and eagerly shoving it down as his taste buds were electrified. He growled deep and low as he gorged himself, a ball of nothing but the instinct to devour, subsume, gobble up all that was in front of him. He ate her in her entirety, all of it, even the fragments of her skull. He belched noisily as he slumped on the grass, his stomach well-rounded. His gut snarled to life and began to digest as he squeezed his eyes shut and splayed out his limbs. Growth surged up within him more than ever before and he let out a long satisfied groan as he felt his paws moving across the grass as his arms lengthened, bone creaking and muscle expanding, his toes curled and stretched in joy and his spine arced. By the end of it he was slumped on the ground, breathing hard and sweating. Fuck. That was better than anything I've ever eaten and more than I've ever grown at one time. Levelers. I need to eat more levelers. He lazily rolled his head to see Opal openly shoving her hand down her shorts and rocking back and forth. She eyed his body hungrily, then seemed to realize he was looking at her. She froze in shock for a moment, then snatched her hand up before blushing furiously and turning away. You like it, don't you? The growth. Opal's shoulders tensed. You like that I'm growing and getting bigger. You really like the growing size difference between us. And no, I don't know what you're talking about. I know you like it, even though you won't admit it, he taunted, amused at her embarrassment. I know your secret too. She yelled back at him with a voice higher pitched and more wobbly than normal. I know why you didn't know about underground forests, and know about levelers, and why you didn't want to eat them. Rain frowned. Did she figure out I used to be human? You were a monster slave, born into it, outside of a dungeon. You were brought up around levelers and taught their ways, you then escaped when they took you to this dungeon. It's the truth, isn't it? Isn't it? Said the goblin, her breath rapidly getting heavier. And now you can eat freely instead of the scraps the slavers gave you. Now why you can grow be bigger. The goblin swallowed, the blush on her face only deepening. Should I tell her I used to be a human, a leveler? No, it may put a wall between us. Levelers hate goblins and goblins hate levelers. Wait, why do I care what she thinks? I don't care, right? He looked up from his musing to find Opal stumbling toward him and tearing at her clothes, breathing hard, her eyes alight with a different kind of hunger. What are you doing? Chapter 13. I can't take it anymore, said Opal as she hopped forward on one foot then the other, dragging off her shorts and fully denuding herself. You're just there every minute with your overwhelming body, and it gets bigger and stronger every day, taunting me. She eagerly dove on his legs where he lay. You don't even know what you're doing to me. It's like just looking at you causes me to heat up, she said as she moved up his legs, her hands clutching at his thighs. And when you get bigger in front of me, your body growing before my eyes, oh gods. She stopped with her hands resting on his hips, her breath tugging at his fur. Oh Opal. Are you serious? Have you lost your mind? Fuck no, I found it. I should have jumped your bones way sooner. She scooted up his thighs until she was sitting over his lap and her hands moved to encircle his black furred sheath which was already starting to thicken. I want you, Rain. You do things to me that make me squirm. Rain was squirming himself under her fondling. As she pushed and squeezed at him, the tip of his dick began to become visible. Opal leant down and ran her tongue around it, slipping inside his sheath as she did so. He let out an involuntary groan and bucked into her, his hips moving of their own accord. She placed her lips over the tip and gently sucked, then glided down until her lips met his sheath, pushing it down and freeing more of his rapidly growing length. He could feel it swelling into her, touching up against her teeth, the roof of her mouth. He clawed the ground as her tongue swirled around his tip, twisting and dragging pleasure from him he hadn't imagined possible. She bobbed her head as he grew inside her, slowly stretching her mouth wider until her lips wrapped around his length in a Ludo shape. She suckled on him as she bobbed her head up and down, teasing his sensitive spots in waves. It didn't take him long at all to come, and he spurted long strings into her mouth which she greedily swallowed down. She removed her mouth, a string of cum connecting her lips to his tip for a second. He hadn't seen his new body like this before, at least 6 inches of dick protruded from his groin. It looked massive next to the tiny 4'5" goblin girl. She shuffled up his legs, rocking her hips provocatively and leaving a wet trail along his fur from where her reddened puss drooled gel-like fluid in long strands. His eyes rose upwards. He had never paid so much attention to the goblin's body before, but what he saw was making him question why he had not. She had smooth clear skin, diving curves into flared hips that drew the eye, and relative to her size and impressive bust, it was no wonder she normally wore a wrap, as every motion was causing her breasts to rock and jiggle. His gaze wandered up to her half-lidded eyes and slightly parted lips. She was breathing so heatedly he was surprised the air wasn't steaming. I need you. Her knees came down either side of his hips and her sopping heated muff pressed his shaft down against his abdomen. She began rubbing herself up and down, pressing against it and gliding her snatch along its top side, leaving a glossy wet trail behind. She went faster and faster, and Rain felt himself begin to get hard again. Her grinding became jumpy and she started to lose rhythm. Her clit pushed free from its hood as she ground herself down on top his length. She squealed as the friction dragged against her. Her legs started to stiffen and she rammed herself down and clapped a hand over her mouth, holding in a shriek. The goblin collapsed against his chest and curled her fingers through his fur as orgasm rocked her, then slowly relaxing, her breathing slowing as she came down from it. Rain was left frustrated, his monstrous instincts even more so. I hope you enjoyed that. But now it's my turn, growled Rain as his paws wrapped around her hips, the beast inside of him rising up, all instinct and animal predator, hungry to fuck and mate and breed. Why yes, fucking dominate me, squealed Opal as Rain picked her up and slammed her down in the grass. He loomed over her, his dick slapping against her stomach, throbbing eagerly. It lay from her groin up and past her belly button, such was their size difference. You thought you could leave me unsatisfied, after you've seen me eat, see my appetite? He leaned in and opened his mouth to the side of her head. Razor-sharp white teeth, a drooling maw. A deep bone-shaking growl began in his chest and rumbled outward, shaking the air and vibrating through the goblin where they were pressed together. You're mine, my toy to do what I like with. I'm going to fuck you into the ground. Your legs will be so weak you won't be able to walk straight. I'm going to ruin you. Yes. Please. Nya, wailed the goblin as her eyes rolled up into her head. Rain gravelled a deep-chested laugh and leant back to align the tip of his dick with her reddened entrance. He pressed himself into her and her muff squished below the broad head of his dick. The pressure increased, slowly applying his strength until with a lewd wet sklop, he slipped inside her, her puss tightly stretching around his width in a thin ring, pushing the limits of what she could contain. She cried out and had to bite down hard on her lip to prevent herself from screaming as her back arched in pleasure. Her hands scrabbled at the grass helplessly and Rain could feel her walls clenching and unclenching around his length as she came once more. You're so tight, you've never had anyone as big as me before, have you? She shook her head furiously as she rode out the aftershocks, her eyes tightly closed. I'm going to stretch you to my size as I grow larger so you can't live without my dick, Opal. You'll be mine and you'll beg for it because you won't be able to live without feeling me fill you to your limit. The goblin gasped and her lips parted as a line of drool ran down her cheek. Just fuck me. Oh gods, fuck me please, begged the goblin as she squirmed on the ground, her hips bucking, trying to push more of Rain inside of her. Rain grinned, his lips drawn back showing his carnivorous teeth, and then he rammed himself home. Then, as she squealed, he sought himself out and slammed inside of her once again. And again. And again. He got into a rhythm, their hips noisily slapping and smacking together, each connection causing the goblin to shift across the ground as Rain's hips crashed up against her muff. Rain could feel his sheath peeling back and he looked down to see that a ball of flesh was pushing free from where it had been hidden, a thick knot of reddened meat at the base of his dick that beat against Opal's entrance with each crash of his hips, pressing into her clit and squashing it up against its clitoral hood. She wailed as he increased his tempo and her eyes shot open, going round as she came once more. This time Rain felt fluid explode around his length and he looked down to see her twitching puss trembling and quaking and gushing fluid, squirting up his abdomen and drenching his fur. Her mouth hung open limp, her hands latched onto his shoulders and clawed at him as she rode out the orgasm, her entire body shaking and twitching, her puss contracting around his length. Rain didn't give her time to recover, only increasing the tempo, slamming into her so hard that her butt jiggled and her breasts went reeling across her chest. She wailed as he rutted her. Harder. Harder. She managed to get out as she lost control of her voice. He complied and his knot rammed into her, once, twice, 3 times, then with a lewd squelch her labia stretched around his knot, pushing beyond her limit, it peeked over the thick ball of flesh and then slipped down, engulfing it. Opal's eyes rolled up and her legs went up, her toes splayed in the air, her mouth hanging wordlessly open as she squirted once more, spraying fluid up between them and soaking them both. Rain gripped down on her hips and dragged her away from his crotch. The poor goblin began gibbering as her muff was pulled outward by Rain's broad knot and with a lewd skull pop. He pulled free as her pussy went wild, twitching and clenching and drenching his fur as sprays of fluid exploded out of her, washing down his length in girlcum, her fingers digging into his shoulders as her back arched into the air. Rain did not relent for a moment. His knot slammed home once more and Opal's puss was forced to take it with no choice in the matter. The goblin howled, her pussy went mad, clenching and rolling and desperately trying to hold Rain inside, but to no avail. He pulled himself free once more as the goblin rolled from one sloppy squirting orgasm into the next. Skull pop. Gush. Squirt. Skull pop. Gush. Squirt. Skull pop. Gush. Squirt. Opal was a helpless mess, her tongue lolling from her mouth and her eyes unfocused as chain orgasms crashed over her. At last, Rain could feel himself readying to come, his knot started to expand. With a savage growl he forced himself inside of her, his dick swelled in size and hot white cum exploded outward, spraying down the goblin's insides. Aye! Howled the goblin as her legs went up, her thighs shaking and her knees quaking, her puss clamped down so hard on Rain that it was verging on painful, but he didn't stop, he pushed at her hips as surge after surge of cum left him, thick white rope after thick white rope. 5th, 6th, 7th, Rain howled as he was milked dry by her clenching, convulsing puss more than he knew he could possibly come. It just kept going and going, drenching her insides and filling her to the brim until she could take no more and ropes of cum spurted from where her cunt stretched around his dick. White exploded up Rain's abs and thighs and landed in splatters on the goblin's belly, filling her belly button. At last, as his 12th load left him, he collapsed on the sweating, heaving goblin completely and utterly spent. After some time spent just baying in the afterglow, Rain levered himself upward on shaky arms. Opal moaned at his movement but seemed otherwise insensate. He looked down to find himself still inside of her. In fact, as he shifted around and tried to pull out, he realized that his knot had swollen to such a degree that he was locked in and knotted to the goblin. Even gripping her thighs and pushing her away had little effect, only bulging out her muff from the knot trapped inside of her. The goblin gasped and seemed to come to her senses. "Ooh, oh gee gods, I can barely move my legs, everything's so tingly, so trembly, I feel like I'm glowing, so hey W, what are you doing? I can't pull out, I'm trapped inside of you." Really?" said Opal, biting her lip and looking down. "That's kinda hot." She wiggled her hips and giggled. "I don't know how long this is going to take to go down. Let's move to the tent." "Okay, but how?" "Put your arms around my neck and I'll carry you." Opal lifted a wobbly arm up but was unable to raise herself up enough to get a grip and she slumped back to the ground. "You turned me into jelly, I feel like my limbs have weights hanging off them." Rain smirked. "You did ask for it. Multiple times." He put a paw under her butt and one around the small of her back, and with a grunt he lifted the goblin and climbed to his feet, causing her to gasp again. She hung off him, pressing down on his sheath, her arms rested limply on his shoulders and her fingers pathetically clutched at the fur on his back. She tried to lift her legs to wrap around him, but after several failed attempts they simply flopped down to hang limp. A line of cum ran down her inner leg to drip from her toe. He turned and was surprised to see he'd come several feet from the spot where Opal had jumped him, having fucked her across the ground, leaving a wake in the grass. He followed the trail back to the tent and with difficulty pulled open the flap and awkwardly crouched down and crawled inside, the goblin clinging to him, softly moaning with each bump. He couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in having left her such a sloppy moaning mess as he lay down on his side, spooning the goblin carefully. His breath moved her long back hair as she occasionally twitched, still feeling aftershocks. As he watched her chest rise and fall, he felt something that he had never felt in his past life, something completely alien to his experiences. He felt protective. Eventually, after what must have been half an hour, Rain felt himself begin to soften and he slowly pulled his hips back. With a soft yelp up, his dick slipped free from her folds and a waterfall of cum oozed from her snatch. It ran down her ass cheek as she lay curled on her side and pooled on the blanket. By this point the goblin was already asleep and Rain soon followed. Chapter 14. Rain gradually came back to consciousness as something tugged at him with greater and greater determination. His eyes cracked open and he looked down blearily to see Opal tugging on his arm, her small hand gripping at his fur. She looked up at him and bit her lip. What is it? Rain wiped some of the sleep from his eyes as he slowly became more alert. Is something happening? Why did you wake me up? I want. You need something? I want to feed you. Oh. Rain blinked at her. We're wasting time just snoozing in bed. I want to go and find monsters and levelers for you to eat and make you bigger and bigger and bigger. Come on, come on. Let's go. Rain sighed. You might have an addiction. Don't tell me you don't feel hungry, you're always hungry. Now you mention it, I am ravenous and there's a cute little snack right beside my bed. He opened his mouth, flashing his carnivorous teeth at her. Opal slapped his arm. Not me, I'm not a snack, I am cute though. He gruffed a laugh and sat up. We can go hunting, but not mushrooms, too slow and inefficient. I need meat, real and bloody and juicy meat. Yes. And lots of it. What about fishing? Opal made a face. I can fish, but it's not enough. One big fish every 1 to 3 days, it's just not enough. I'm not a fishing gobbo, I'm a scouting gobbo, I'm better at not fishing stuff. Rain gave her a questioning look. Okay, so what not fishing things do you have in mind? Opal smiled slyly. Oh, I have something in mind. I know the area you know. I know you know. He gestured with a paw and Opal crawled from the tent. He watched with amusement as she left a few drips of white behind her, still leaking from the night before. He crawled out after her and clambered to his feet, where he opened his maw wide and yawned, cracking his joints in the cavern light. He had no idea if it was truly morning or night. The dungeon seemed to operate on a casual cycle, i.e. sleep and wake when you want. It didn't matter what your sleep schedule was, the moss and crystal light would always be steady and continuous. Opal was still on the ground, having crawled out of the tent. She looked up at him and then, with a look of determination in her eye, she got her feet under her and with trembling legs slowly rose to stand. Her knees shook as a line of white rolled down her inner thigh. I'm okay, I can walk, watch. She lifted a foot forward carefully, then stepped, paused to catch her balance, then took another step. She looked up at Rain with a grin. See. She lost her footing as she looked up and her legs buckled. She grabbed at Rain's waist and clung to him to keep herself standing. I'm not sure I do see. Your legs are like a pair of wet noodles. No, they're not. She glared at him fiercely. Rain pursed his lips and stepped away from her. Without support, she sunk down to the ground and sat down. This is your fault. You're right, it actually is. I fucked you silly until you went weak in the legs and you loved it. I didn't know you would take such a long time to recover from it, however. Just stay there and try to recoup your strength while I decamp. She crossed her arms and huffed but watched as he pulled down the tent and kicked apart the fire, then stowed all their stuff in Opal's rucksack. He looked between the goblin, who was currently struggling to rise to her feet, and the large rucksack. You're not good for much if you can't even do the thing you said you could contribute, you know. That's not fair. Your dick made me like this. Rain scratched his chin and rolled his eyes. He then stalked over to the goblin and, to her dismay, lifted her up onto his shoulders using his outsized strength. She protested loudly, but being able to do nothing to stop him, she soon quieted down. He picked up the rucksack with one paw. Directions. HMPHH. Still need me, huh? She lifted one hand from where she was holding onto his wolf ears for balance and pointed. It's that way. Rain nodded and set off across the plateau and climbed down into the forest. He stomped through the grass and undergrowth between the trees, Opal wobbling along on his shoulders and trying to avoid any low-hanging branches. It wasn't long before they made their way to the edge of the foggy ancient woods and came to a halt by a dark cave that sloped away into the ground. The goblin had guided them well away from any sleeping mushroom monsters, and they had been undisturbed as they walked. Opal tugged at his ear. Wait. Let me get some clothes on first. She wiggled and he gently lowered her to the ground bum first and then tossed the rucksack beside her. She gave him an annoyed look but rifled through it. Have you never heard of any kind of organization, damned wolf? Wait, did you bring a knife? Ah, here we go. She pulled out a knife that had belonged to the half-elf Rain had eaten and put it aside, then she pulled her clothes free and wrapped her chest. She then tried fruitlessly to put her shorts on. Rain watched and couldn't help but let out a laugh at her clumsy weakness. After a moment he leant down and grabbed the shorts from her hands, then shoved and handled her feet until they lined up with the holes and forcefully dragged them up her legs to sit snug on her hips, lifting her up into the air a bit as he thrust them into place. "Hey. Careful. I'm still sensitive down there." She batted away his paws from her hips and picked up the knife. She looked up at Rain questioningly, who after a pause gave her a slight affirmative nod. "Trust." The goblin's cheeks colored. She then laboriously climbed to her feet. She took a few wobbly steps, then a few more. "Oh. I can walk again." "Small miracles," murmured Rain. "Shush. Look, it's this way, the place where we might be able to get food." "Oh, we might have to fight for it, just so you know." She waved the knife taken from the half-elf in the air enthusiastically and then sunk to a crouch as her legs gave way. Rain held out an arm and the goblin swallowed her pride and grabbed onto it. She pulled herself to her feet and Rain began walking down into the cave with the goblin holding onto him for balance and support. They wandered through the dark for some time, slowed by Opal's occasional missteps, though that was happening less and less as she rapidly recovered her strength. They came across a thin jagged seam in the wall of the long cave they were traversing, and through it Rain could see another large open cave with clean white sand covering the floor. "This is it," whispered Opal. "Look, you can see their camp." Rain peeked through the seam and saw what looked like what had been a fairly significant camp with 4 separate fires and multiple bedrolls and tents, though it was deserted now. "What am I looking at?" "Kobold outpost. They liked to raid our tribe whenever we went hunting in the ancient forest. There are about 20 of the bastards." "20? That's way beyond anything I can deal with. We had enough trouble with just a few, don't you remember?" "Oh, that's easy. We just need to draw them out into the forest and then I can repeat the same trick with the mushrooms. We're near enough that they should follow that far. That is if they are still around. HRMM. If they find us I'm going to carry you out of here, just so you know. I don't want to be running and then see you flop down like a wet fish because your legs won't hold your weight." "Fine. But if we're smart they shouldn't get close. I know a bunch of secret passages they don't know of around here." She gestured at the seam as though it were an example. The goblin led the way further down the passage and then down a side tunnel, through a crack in the wall and then through a low-hanging wide cave that they had to crouch to get through. It was as they were leaving the cave that a sound met their ears, a hissing, growling, roaring sound, like a snake's hiss but multiplied in intensity. Rain gave her a questioning look but she just shrugged her shoulders. They came out of the low-ceilinged cave and emerged into a massive sandy cavern. Huge house-sized boulders were everywhere, often with large glowing crystals growing from them, leaving the distant ceiling dark but the ground flooded with warm sunlight like light. They scampered into the massive cave and hid behind a rock as another terrible roaring hiss sounded and dust trickled from the ceiling far above. "I bet whatever that is behind why your kobold outpost is deserted." "Probably. This might be a good opportunity for us if we can take advantage." She took his paw and led them on a meandering path through the boulders. She paused and then put her back up against one particularly large rock and peeked around it. Rain leaned over her and did the same. A sandy circular clearing met their eyes, which was populated by 15 or so kobolds spread out around it. Much more importantly was the gargantuan snake that they were facing. A bulky blue and green and black scaled beast of a monster at least 50 foot long from tip to tail. Its head was raised up in the air, putting it at least a dozen feet off the ground and towering over the kobolds. It let out another hissing roar, flashing its saber-sized fangs and a bloodied mouth. "What do we do? Attack?" asked Opal. "We wait for our moment." Chapter 15. The group of kobolds began to coalesce around their leader, a taller than average green and red kobold wearing a gold chain necklace and carrying a wide-bladed cutlass. He held up his sword. "On me. On me. Can't you see it's wounded? It is ours to kill." The other kobolds roared and held their weapons aloft. The nearest kobold to the snake charged right at it with a spear and actually managed to pierce its scale. The furious snake snapped around as soon as it felt pain, and the kobold managed only one terrified look before a terrible pink mouth engulfed his upper body, swallowed, lifted and gulped the kobold down. A bulge slowly sunk down the snake's neck, joining 5 other bulges that ran the length of its body, which Rain realized were the other 5 other kobolds missing from the 20 Opal had expected. The leader ignored this and busily arranged his kobolds into a shield formation, a line of 7 kobolds carrying heavy plank shields while a line of 7 more behind them held spears that poked between the shields. "Slow forward," cried the leader, and the shield line moved. The snake hissed in anger and snapped at the air in front of them, trying to get at the kobolds but fearing the sharp spears that tracked its face. The wall neared and the snake backed up, hissing and spitting as the sharp spears jabbed at its scales. The leader kobold dived between the shields and with a twisting slash carved a jagged line up the snake's side. The snake screamed and lurched backwards, its coiled body oscillating and forming up to wrap around itself protectively. The motion shifted and brushed the sands aside, revealing smooth white and round objects hidden beneath. Eggs. The snake realized what it had done and moved its body to protect the eggs, but the spears came on relentlessly. With blind fear in its eyes, the snake roared once more, and seemingly having decided it had no better option, it dived at the shield wall, risking everything in an act of protective desperation. 1, 2, 3 spears punctured deep into the snake's body, but it made it through. It crashed down on the shields with a roar of victory, instantly crushing 3 of the kobolds below its weight. Its coiled body swept through the sand like a whip, once, twice, 3 times, an unstoppable force fueled by pure outrage. Kobolds tumbled before its scales, smashed aside with broken bones. The kobold leader roared and flames exploded from his open mouth in a cone that washed up against the snake and engulfing part of its body in fire. The snake thrashed in pain and tried to escape the flame, but the kobold tracked its body with his head blackening and crisping its scales in a huge swathe. It seemed like the snake was done for, but the leader kobold was clearly starting to struggle. His expression was strained and his brow furrowed in concentration, reddening with effort. Suddenly he choked and the flame winked out. He looked on in horror as the blackened but still perfectly mobile and increasingly angry snake roared and lunged for him. The kobold deflected the sighing teeth with his cutlass, and on the back foot he retreated as the snake repeatedly snapped and bit at him, looking to end him before he could breathe fire once again. The leader backed up against a particularly large boulder and was left with nowhere to flee as the snake cornered him. For blood and riches, howled the kobold as he went for one last desperate gambit, diving under the snake's swift jaw and raising his cutlass to stab up into its soft underbelly. Unfortunately, the snake saw it coming and twisted from his reach. Its head whipped around and its teeth took him in the side. Blood splattered across the white sand, and the kobold, minus his leg and a good chunk of his side, was tossed against a large boulder where he slumped to the ground, leaving a bloody smear. The snake hissed in triumph and reared up above the kobold, gloating in its well-earned victory. The kobold spat blood and raised his sword from where he lay in the sand, the tip of his blade wobbling as it pointed at the serpent. "I hope you choke on me, you shitty snake, I-." A shadow dropped from the top of the boulder and landed on top the snake's neck at the base of its skull. A grisly crunch met the kobold's ears and the snake thrashed in panic. Another crunch, the snake screamed in agony. One more bone-splintering sound and the snake went limp and fell to the ground like wet rope. A black-furred monster pulled its head from the bucket-sized hole it had made in the snake's neck, shards of spine dropping from its muzzle. Blood washed down its front and hung in grisly strands from its teeth. The kobold looked into its yellow eyes and saw a hunger unlike anything he had ever known, a beastly greedy hunger that knew no limits. His eyes drifted to his soldiers groaning in the sand, nursing broken or shattered bones or crawling away. "Gee, get away," he called, blood burbling up with every word. A number of the kobolds looked up. "Run, you fools! Flee! It's something worse! Run for your lives!" A flicker of green at his side and a knife appeared at his throat. "They're already dead, they just don't know it yet. They are all going in my wolfie's belly, every last one. Save your breath for the gods." The kobold could only watch in dismay as the evil wolf thing went from injured kobold to injured kobold and extinguished their life with a snap of his jaws. They could do nothing, even as they realized what was happening and tried to crawl or limp away. The wolf simply pounced on them and ended their lives. There was no honor here, only death. Why, you could have let them live. The goblin ignored him and joined the wolf thing, helping it strip the bodies of his soldiers. The kobold watched as it began to devour his people. He couldn't believe his eyes. The monster did not simply eat, it consumed. Sliding whole sections of limbs into its jaws, then biting and swallowing, then continuing onward into the torso, its teeth scissoring through scale and flesh, making whole chunks of his soldiers disappear with casual ease. The monster's stomach bulged with his people. Surely the beast had to stop soon, which it did, and then it sat. The kobold watched with rising dismay as the stomach of the wolf thing trembled and then began to shrink down flat. "What fresh horror has this dungeon wrought upon us?" he murmured as his eyes slowly drifted shut and darkness bloomed.